All panelists, please mute your videos.
Hotep, Akwaba, and hello. Welcome to Temple University's Department of Africology's webinar on race, racism, and anti-racism, redefining the social contract. We appreciate certainly the support that we have received from the College of Liberal Arts. My name is Molefi Keti Asante. I am professor and chair of the Department of Africology at Temple University, where we created the first doctorate in African American Studies. I am the author of 92 books, including Erasing Racism. I libate today to and for African ancestors brought to this land 400 years ago against their will. I do not forget the Lenape and their brothers and sisters who lost an entire continent to invasion. The genocide of the native peoples and the enslavement of Africans constitute the primal context for the continual killing of Black people, not only by police, but sometimes by ordinary white citizens. The outpouring of rage by intellectual activists, many of whom do not consider themselves public intellectuals because they were not made by the media, but by their consistent and persistent commitment to African liberation, culturally, politically, and economically, convinced me soon after the murder of George Floyd that there should be a platform for these profoundly brilliant thinkers to share with the public their thoughts and interventions about and for these times, conditions, social contract hierarchies, and anti-racist policies and behaviors. We could not accommodate all of the speakers who wanted to share this platform, but our aim was to let you listen to some of the most original thinkers of our day. In the future, we shall have other webinars and bring to your attention the significant work of other scholars and thinkers. I am grateful for the webinar format because the collective total of a conference of this type with these individuals would cost nearly $450,000 given their reputations and normal fees. Obviously, they are my friends and have not charged me or the university for their appearances. One day I shall repay them with a web visit. I also wish to indicate that we have 3 of our graduate students speaking today, and you will be pleased to see them. Each speaker will speak for no more than 10 minutes. Given the unusually dynamic nature of the topic, some will be tempted to do more and to say more, but our format will not allow it today. I will introduce each speaker. They will speak, and I will introduce the next speaker. Questions can be asked, and we will try to answer a few of them if we have a chance. Otherwise, we will bank them and use them for future webinar discussions. For your information, we are also streaming live on my Facebook page. Our first speaker today is Dr. Ifetayo Flannery. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies at San Francisco State. She's the author of several articles on African culture and the African diaspora, as well as the book, Introduction to Black Psychology. Dr. Flannery.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. I'm humbled to present first to lay the foundation for the brilliant speakers we have. So first, I'd just like to give honor to my own consciousness and to my ancestors, Iba Ori, Iba Egumi, Iba Orisha Ashe. May my ancestors allow me to speak. May the truth be in me today, Ashe. So with my 10 minutes, I would like to cover 3 points. And so I'm going to talk about the nature of racism. I want to talk about the marriage of racism to patriarchy. And then I want to talk about reparations. Racism. For me, racism is really simply the religious philosophy and cultural ideas of a people combined with the institutional structures that implement the ideas. Sometimes we talk about racism is so complicated. Racism is so difficult. Racism is so sturdy and unmalleable. But the reality is, if we can create instruments, if we have NASA, if we can go to the moon, okay, and we can make these type of discoveries, then we can surely get to the bottom of racism and we can dismantle it. So what in fact is in the way? Something that's important to understand is that it's more than just knowing. There's a false mythology that knowing better is doing better. So we know how to technically lose weight. We know how to technically stop smoking. We know how to do certain things, but it doesn't mean that we have the capability or the momentum or the support to change the behavioral structure. So again, racism is not just the idea, it is the idea combined with the implementing structures that allow us to have observable outcomes of racial disparities time and time again. So most importantly, when we think about these structures, we have to think about how to close the gap between the behavior and the belief. In some countries like Cuba and Brazil, they have racial structures that implement racial differences between people who would be considered darker and people who would be considered lighter, but they don't have a racial consciousness per se in that nation state. They would say we don't have racism here, or we don't think about racial identities as significant. And so we don't want to misconstrue the idea between consciousness, the beliefs, and the racial structures. We have to practice, implementing and dismantling racial structures. We cannot wait for the consciousness of people to catch up with. We cannot hope that one day people will know better or do better. And this is where we've confused the idea of racial amicability with racial equity. A lot of times in universities and places of higher learning, we say that diversity is evidence of closing that gap between the racial structure and the racial belief. But diversity is still an attitude, it's still a belief system. It's a belief that if we actually include people, that maybe that we will have a better representation of the human potentiality. But the structure itself that precedes that idea is that by technicality, we can actually be segregated and still strive to racial excellence without diversity, which is why we have to implement diversity as a practice. And so my point here on the nature of racism is that, again, knowing is not just doing better. And we cannot wait and we cannot anticipate that people's behavioral practice, no matter their good intentions, will change without doing structural implementation, which is why I'll talk about reparations last. My next point, number 2, is how racism is really married to patriarchy. And so I don't think that dismantling racism can happen without a conversation around patriarchy. How is racism married to patriarchy, and how do we understand that? If we look at our own cultural traditions, which is all we have, there is evidence that the way that African people have understood what a sovereign people look like, what an independent civilization looks like, must include a queen mother. Particularly in the Ghanaian region, they have implemented this system over for thousands of years. And so we understand that in Ghana, for example, with Queen Mother Nanya Asantewa, it's understood that we are not a free people if we don't have a queen mother. This kind of cultural practice was passed on, and it exists in the diaspora. So when we think and we pay homage to the Maroon communities, and especially to what? Queen Nanny, who represented one of the most famous Maroon societies in Jamaica. That is not by happenstance. The idea that to be a Maroon, or to be now a free people with our own agency and with our own institutional structure, we must have a female leader. And so I encourage us to think about and stretch the boundaries of Black nationalism, stretch the boundaries of Pan-Africanism, stretch the boundaries of nationhood studies, Black studies, to understand that dealing with patriarchy is not simply an ode to women. It's not like, oh, we'll treat the sisters better. It's much deeper than that. Based on our own cultural history and based on our own spiritual science, we know that we are not in alignment with power. We're not in alignment with having or being recognizable as a free people by our ancestors without having female leadership. So I think we should even develop a language that removes sort of this gender women's studies out of this compartment, and that really integrates from what it means from our own perspective of understanding the balance between feminine and masculine in order to exist as a free people. If we're dismantling racism to exist as a free people, then what structure do we have left to construct a new society and a new organization of ourselves? So I would argue that there's some terminology that we can use to begin to restructure how we think about racism, how we think about patriarchy. We have blinders on right now in a sense, because in our methodological approach, in our epistemological approach, the premise, even using the words white supremacy or patriarchy, assumes that the very thing that we're trying to criticize or deconstruct is already superior. So I encourage us even to stop using the word white supremacy, because as you enter the conversation, no matter what angle you're coming from, the white is supreme already. And so one of my colleagues and friends, Dr. Adisa Ajamu, articulates that we could actually be saying white misanthropy. White misanthropy. Misanthropy means, an extreme distrust, a contempt, a hatred for humankind. Okay, so that is really at the core of what we mean when we say white supremacy. However, if we articulate our epistemology and our arguments around saying white misanthropy, we don't assume the position that in any conversation we're prepared to have that white people are dominant, because that creates a boundary. It creates a false hierarchy, even in our ability to conceptualize ideas of empowerment. This is the same thing with patriarchy. Patriarchy is not a fixed system in the way that we talk about it. So perhaps we can use language like a culture of patriarchy. A culture of patriarchy exists here. So that when we're trying to discover new ways of constructing sovereignty, freedom, as a people of African descent, we are understanding that we're actually dealing with a system of culture and beliefs, and not something that is fixed or that is inevitable.
Thank you.
I wanted to make one last point about reparations, if I have time. My last point is about reparations, and I truly believe that we're not having any serious conversation about racism or without a conversation about reparations. Reparations would be the force that we need to engage a true action towards changing the power dynamics, because that's really what racism is a fixed set of power dynamics. I think that we can't have a serious conversation about racism without understanding that there is a dialectic between whiteness and blackness. So if we're not actually engaging the people of African descent and what our perspectives are on racism, then we haven't really gotten to the root. There's a lot of evidence that shows that African people have been engaged with the conversation around reparations from the time of slavery to now. It's not a new idea. But oftentimes it's been misrepresented as simply a payment, that if you pay up, then we'll be finished. And I won't share my entire plan in the interest of time, but I think one important thing that we should consider with the reparations project for African people is that we actually need time to think. You can't hold a gun to someone's head when they've been in perpetual crises and say, make a decision right now. What should I do with your children? We can't do that. In our reparations project plan, I think that we have to engage that we need at least 20 years to just think. We need time to recap. We need time to investigate what will actually be appropriate for us to move forward, for us to reconcile particular relationships and power dynamics. And in this time, Black people need to receive major concessions. They should not have to pay federal taxes, for example, or educational debt. And so this is some things that we must think about, because if we remember, and I learned this from studying the New African movement in the United States, that we actually never had the decision we never made the decision to become citizens. We didn't go from being enslaved to free. We went from being enslaved to being married to the state in a very abusive way. If we had the option to say, what actually do we want to do as a free people, we need that time to investigate how that might look and play out, regardless of if we stay, if we leave, or whatever concessions that are necessary. So these are some things that I hope we can sit with. I'm so grateful to be able to speak today, Dr. Asante, and I thank you for this time, and I thank everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ifeanyi Flannery. And, I did not indicate, but she is an alum of Temple University's Department of Africology. We're going to ask the presenters to remember that we have many other presenters today. So if you could just keep to 10 minutes, that will really help us a lot because of our program. And we have all tremendous people who could themselves, I know, speak for many hours. Dr. Ronald Jackson, who is a professor, former dean at the University of Cincinnati and president of the National Communication Association, and one of the leaders, perhaps the leading African scholar in the communication field who studies race and culture. And among his more than 20 books are Scripting the Black Masculine Body and Understanding African American Rhetoric. We're going to ask him to take his 10 minutes. Dr. Ronald Jackson.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. Hotep, everyone.
Hotep.
It's my pleasure to be here. It's awesome to have the opportunity to engage in intellectual dialogue around some of the most pressing issues of our time. My remarks today are entitled, On the Precipice, Can We Trust It? Baldwin once stated that to be Black and to be relatively conscious in America is to be enraged almost all the time. Cornel West has stated that Black people's humanity is a relatively new discovery of the West. Let those ideas sink in for a moment, that we are enraged, but that we are just now being discovered in terms of our own humanity. As we stand at the precipice of America's revisitation with race, I am left with mixed emotions. I want to be hopeful. The images and news media coverage showing people of all backgrounds across the world standing in defiance against racism gives me hope and inspiration. And in this moment, I also find myself fighting the reflex to interrogate the authenticity of this kumbaya expression of mostly unified sense of humanity. I have so many questions. Why now? Black folks have been waiting over 400 years for the nation to realize the vicious attack on our humanity. Why now? We have traversed oceans, plantations, legislation, classrooms, and boardrooms. Why now? We have been enslaved, lynched, brutalized, incarcerated, attacked, dismissed, and devalued. Why now? We are survivors, and yet at this very moment, something seems to have changed. So I have two fundamental questions I want to share with you today and to kind of unpack a little bit with you. The first one I'll spend most of my time on, and that is, what does this mean? What does this moment mean? The socio-political machinery that has erected the race-based I-other dialectic has actually worked itself into a bit of dysfunction. By naming the other as perversely odd and abnormal, the dominant I in this racialized I-other dialectic has become disfigured itself. Whiteness is no longer recognizable as simply a descriptor of white people. Instead, as the Confederate statute debacle illustrates, it has become an obscenely narcissistic public scaffold that everyone must confront in America. Either marginalized bodies honor and conform to it, or it morphs in such a way that they suffer the indignities of being perceived as perpetually, inescapably abnormal. These Confederate monuments are just emblematic of a larger racial problem. Of course, on the other hand, that leaves a dilemma that Roediger and Mills and McLaren talk about when they contend that there are some whites who do not want to claim hegemonic privilege and its responsibility for social misery, but they cannot opt out of whiteness. They are entangled in this intricate web of social dominance that pretends democratic collapse at the very moment whiteness maneuvers to subjugate and classify socially marked differences. While there is perhaps no way out, many whites have found that coalition building has helped them atone for the destruction that unchecked whiteness facilitates. It was just 1 month ago, on June 1, The Black Enterprise magazine reported a story with the headline, "White protesters form human barrier to shield Black protesters from Louisville Metro Police." Again, I was excited to see this image. It was as though the cavalry had arrived. It was like your cousin and them showing up on the playground after they heard that a bully was picking on you. Of course, they hadn't actually rescued us. We were already on the front lines. In fact, it may actually have been that we rescued them. But the image nonetheless was enchanting. I then found myself worried that this might be perhaps a replay of the public fantasy of post-racialism that has wreaked epistemic and very real physical violence on marginalized bodies. I don't think I'm alone in thinking this way. These thoughts are the natural instincts cultivated by anyone who has been in a survival mode their entire lives. And so I became worried about what I was witnessing. I mean, you think about this. We've been in a survival mode as a collective for many, many, many years. We've been colonized, brutalized, left for dead, and stranded for 400 years, and we are constantly finding ourselves thinking in a way that feels a bit suspicious of whites. So we're instantly suspicious of this, and we almost immediately exclaim, well, I don't need white folks to save me. Our mistrust is harrowing. Whiteness is a peculiar condition. White people are taught not to see race, let alone their privilege, and we on this call are actually no better. We too have various types of privilege. For those of us who are able-bodied, when is the last time you entered a building and began to wonder where the handicap exits were? Did you survey all around to check that out? Probably not, because your privilege allows you not to have to think about it. And racial privilege and racism work the same exact way. Unfortunately, people too frequently tend to treat racism like an auto accident on the side of the expressway. Remember the last time you saw an accident? You were on your way somewhere, and then you saw a stranded vehicle. Maybe you saw a couple of vehicles that it looked like they had just collided. And immediately you began to think about all the other things you could be doing, all the other places that you needed to go. And within moments, you pretty much forgot that the accident even occurred. You don't even know what the color of the cars look like. You don't know who the people are. You didn't even look at the details. Racism operates the same way. As people go about their normal days, suddenly they are finding themselves witness to issues, witness to confrontations around race. The inherent violence in the act of racism is deeply disturbing, but it's not always physically violent. Alternatively, it can be emotionally, psychologically, and relationally violent. If you are fortunate enough to be merely a witness rather than a target of racism, then the immediate human reflex is to be grateful that it's not happening to you. Despite the momentary gasp or the instinct telling you this is not okay and that perhaps people are hurt, you figure out that you have somewhere else to be, somewhere else to go. The rationale goes, it's not happening to me, I'm not the target. The people affected by this will be okay. Perhaps one of the saddest parts of that is that within 60 seconds, we don't know any of the details. And so people are left to grapple with the aftermath. And it's happened for us for many, many years, and we're frustrated by it. The violence that's left, the emotional and psychological residue continues to traumatize us again and again. So when theorizing about whiteness, philosopher George Yancey notes that there's no distinction between whiteness, white supremacy, and white people. It can be argued that Yancey is right to do so, especially because of the ways in which many white people navigate whiteness in their own places in these structures. They assume they are not actively seeking to be racist, or that because they are not violently racist, then they are not sustaining it at all. There needs to be a consideration of how not questioning or examining the overwhelming whiteness of institutions and systems leads to racial discrimination. And that's what this moment is allowing us to consider. So when I saw this photo of white protesters forming this human barrier on the front lines, I had a lot of scenarios, a series of what ifs came to mind. What if this regularly happened in academia? I mean, I'm reminded of the singer Common in his song called The Truth, where he says, took a picture of the truth and tried to develop it. I'd like to be able to figure out how we can expand the truth in academia, the truth that looks like it's happening on the front line, the truth that white people could actually be the barrier between us and the white supremacy that gets perpetuated as a result of their habitat. Imagine if our colleagues were energized about telling the whole truth, if they were unafraid to admit that the birthplace of humankind was an Olduvai Gorge, if they were willing to admit that the early philosophical underpinnings of every discipline that we learn in higher education institutions began with people who began at the very beginning of humankind. That what if we did not teach it as though Greece and Rome were the origins of every mode of thought? This would be radical and progressive. To move toward a radical progressive pedagogy is to centralize humanity. Likewise, to talk about race without talking about humanity is like talking about water without recognizing its connection to oxygen. There's an interdependent quality and context. Humanity presumes a premium is placed on human dignity, respect, and value. In the absence of humanity, we are lost. To preserve humanity, we must control myths, lest we suffer a sort of characterological deficiency. Blackness is an ineluctable facet of Black life, and it's also been linked to whiteness inextricably. It is an adjective by itself, but it's an adjective that points to the history of resistance of white encroachment and white supremacy. It has become an I other dialectic that is indivorceable racial matrix. And so committing ourselves to a kind of social justice that does not celebrate visual memories, but instead celebrates progress and true liberation means that we have to execute what love looks like. We remember what Cornel West says about this, that social justice is what love looks like in public. Well, yes, that's true, but we have to go beyond that. We have to think about our own freedom and liberation. We have to be able to define what that looks like. Ralph Ellison once proclaimed that the end is in the beginning, which lies far ahead. We can't even start the work toward freedom until we admit our liabilities, our faults, our frail insecurities, and our collective unwillingness to truly engage radical progressive change. So when I saw the photo of white protesters, I had a lot of what ifs in mind. What if this regularly happened in the courtroom? What if it regularly happened in Senate chambers? What if it regularly happened in the boardrooms? What if it regularly happened in public? I'm reminded of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in the dialogue between Brutus and Ligarius, when Brutus turns to Ligarius and says, a piece of work that will make sick men whole. And Ligarius says, but are there not some whole that we must make sick? So when we think about the scripting of Black bodies, the pathologies associated with Black bodies, the continuous link between extreme poverty and dysfunction and criminality and undereducation, chronic underemployment and so forth, we come to understand that there's a constant struggle to shift the narratives associated with who we are. Brother Professor Karenga has helped us to think about this with the Nguzo Saba, giving us tools for thinking about self-empowerment. We have always fought against monuments, not just the Confederate monuments, but the monuments that have tried to erect themselves every place we go, every place where we seek success. So I know that we're cutting short on time, so let me just come to a conclusion on this. The trouble with whiteness is that it is a slippery signifier of race in America. The American evacuation of democracy is a public declaration for the troubling sense of where we land around social justice. I want us to move forward. I need us to move forward. I believe that forums like this will help us to get there. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We know who they are. And so I only ask that as we seek to stand in solidarity, let's also seek to stand along with freedom, the efforts around trying to secure our freedom and liberation. I thank you. I appreciate you all, and God bless you. Your mic is off, Dr. Asante. Dr. Asante, you're still on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. I just want to say that I know all of you are trying to help me and encourage me, but the time is extremely important, given the fact that we do have 22 people speaking. So if you could stay within the 10 minutes, that would really help me. I'm going to introduce now Dr. Nadav, Assistant Professor of Africology at Temple University, former Associate Professor at Medgar Evers College, and a key theorist of patriarchy, hierarchy, and culture, a Jopian scholar and author of the important book, African Mothers. Dr. Dove. Unmute. She needs to unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. I'm very proud to be a professor in the Africology department, the first in the world, and thank you for creating it in the first place. I'm going to talk about what is race and racism and anti-racism is possible. There exists a hierarchy of humanity based mainly on melanin content. It's the fundamental belief of white supremacy, and white men and women are at the top of this hierarchy, this human hierarchy, and it's patriarchal. Beneath the white men and women are yellow, the red, the brown, the black, and all women are below the men. But the special place of the white woman is that she is above all men and women in all the other supposed races. And much collaborative work has gone into trying to prove the inferiority of African black people. Inferiority studies range from history, language, psychology, spirituality, and behavior to sizes and shapes of skulls, penises, and vaginas, to name a few. These studies are very fundamental to all academic disciplines, bar Africology. As academics, we are encumbered by racist theories and sciences that underpin liberal arts disciplines, such as history, literature, writing, philosophy, sociology, psychology, and the creative arts, and so on. Our work as Africologists is to develop Afrocentric theory grounded in truth regarding the history and her story of African people and therefore humanity. In the Department of Africology, we know that we are a people whose ancestors are African, and we are reclaiming our true cultural heritage. We are moving away from Aryan Eurocentrism and Arab centrism that claim the authenticity of race in religious and evolutionary terms. Examples are the Genesis story of Noah and his black son, Sudras, the untouchables in Brahmanism, the Khoisan people, better known as the Hottentot in evolution, who are considered intermediaries between apes and humans. In reality, Sudras built the Harappan civilization and were literate and matriarchal before 1,000 years before Aryans arrived. The Khoisan people recorded the phases of the moon in relation to women's periods over 35,000 years ago on the Lubombo baboon stone. Their calculations are still used today, and their language is the oldest and most complex language in the world. Sheikh and Diop theorized that major distinctions between people are actually cultural. Culture is a human endeavor that all human groups develop in an attempt to make sense of their lives and bring order. As a powerful purveyor of ideas, values, and beliefs, culture aids in the shaping of human thought and behavior. Culture shapes and designs the structures of social institutions such as family, healthcare, education, politics, economics, entertainment, the arts, and spiritual systems. Episteme, which is knowledge, is a critical ingredient in culture, and knowledge is the key to developing and sustaining culture. Episteme shapes and is shaped by culture. Knowledge can be false, as in the case of white supremacy. Ideally, the development of episteme should be based on truth so that logic can exist. A cultural group must be able, therefore, to answer basic questions like where did we come from, who are we, why are we here, and where are we going? Noted by Dr. Hilliard. Knowledge or lack of knowledge of human history and her story play a vital role in what is believed about the past and therefore about possible futures. All cultures must love their humanity. If you live in a culture in which your humanity is debased and demonized, it's not your culture. Africology connects ancient Africa to people of African descent throughout the world. We are learning our ancient cultural beliefs before conquest. In this way, we may challenge Arab-centric and Eurocentric beliefs in who they claim we are. As Dr. Asante has found, there are no universities, even in Africa, that begin history and her story at the beginning before conquest. We understand that Africa is the birthplace of humanity, the site of the first human culture, and that African matriarchy requires male-female reciprocity and for the survival of humanity and the development of culture, and that is the first human culture. There's one race, we know this, the race of humanity. According to Diop, cultural distinctions are grounded in the relationship between women and men, the smallest unit of any cultural society. Out of Africa came male-female reciprocity called African matriarchy. Over time and with the changing climates and phenotypes, patriarchy, the domination of the woman by the man, evolved. The woman was considered a burden. This new unjust relationship was the first hierarchy, rising in contradiction to female-male reciprocity, which is the foundation of ethical behavior and democratic ideals. In order to maintain this falsehood, justification was paramount. The woman is not inferior to the man, we understand. But domination is highly profitable and is the foundation of individualism and greed. Thoughts of superiority as a justification for domination were fostered. This particular hierarchy reflected institutionally in the family, society, nation, etc., evolved a new episteme out of which the hierarchy of humanity and the construction of race were developed. Patriarchy and race can be viewed as synonymous. It appears that you cannot have one without the other. These patriarchs, Hyksos, Persians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, invaded and conquered Kemet many times. It was the Kushites of the 25th dynasty who created an African Renaissance and instituted women leaders back into the state system. The ancient Africans would come to know patriarchy as chaos, which we call Isfet, and so it is and was across the rest of Africa. The European construction of race and the heinous crimes committed against black humanity over the centuries was borrowed from the holy text of their Aryan ancestors, the Brahmins, the Semitic Arab Middle Eastern texts, the Christian texts, and the Islamic texts. In reality, these texts were plagiarized from the African holy text, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, based on reciprocity between the woman and the man. That is why the older concept of God is both female and male. These conquerors were jealous of their teachers' knowledge, wisdom, and beauty. They plagiarized and stole the learnings, then they invented sacred stories of racial hierarchy, where they became the teachers and their teachers became their slaves. The idea that you would be judged by what good you brought into the world is in total opposition to the idea that you are already judged based on the color of your skin. While patriarchy created race, race predominates. Patriarchal women and men formed an alliance and profited from this construction. Women and men of African descent were born with the deep memory of African matriarchal cultural values and beliefs, and ancestors watching over us. African culture has sustained African black lives from the time of the Aryan, Semitic, and European enslavement until now. Our anti-racist work. We live in white supremacy, and our work is to move away from analyzing and judging ourselves through the racial lens of white supremacy and look through a cultural prism at our cultural differences. This ages and becoming the African matriarchal people. Some of us through domination, which has been cruel, systematic, and continuous, have been trained in European and Arabic values and beliefs and believe in the histories and her stories of who we are. Sometimes unwittingly we practice the masters and mistresses' beliefs, often without a clear understanding of our own. We're not supposed to love our blackness. We are supposed to love trying to become white, the epitome of humanity, which of course we can never achieve. In this regime, the most melanated people are the most vulnerable and endangered. Although the construction of race is a falsehood, we live and die by this belief every day. Africology and Afrocentric theory have had to fight against racism and disrespect to survive as a department. We have gone from 14 professors to 7. Not only must the department be expanded, the teaching must be expanded. The department has taken a leadership role in developing new curriculum throughout the world. In fact, These ideas should be taught in all educational institutions from nursery to university. We are here today because of the countless millions of African women, men, and children whose blood has been shed and is still being shed to facilitate the continuing wealth of systems of racialized oppression across the world. They died for us to live. Thank you.
Want to thank Dr. Dove. What we're trying to do, and I'm going to ask all of you, make sure that your microphones are muted unless you're speaking. We have some people who we're hearing noise in the background, and I just want to make sure that you will do that. Our next speaker will be Dr. Joyce King. She is the Benjamin Mays Endowed Professor of Education at Georgia State University. She was a former provost at Spelman College. She's one of the most prominent cultural scholars and leaders in education, and was the past president of the AERA, the American Educational Research Association, author of numerous publications, including Afrocentric Praxis for Teaching for Freedom and Heritage Knowledge in the Curriculum. Dr. Joyce King.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asante, and it's my pleasure to be here with so many well-informed and illustrious colleagues. I am going to try to stick to my time, and if you see me approaching my time, would you say, Dr. King, your time is up? And I will stop. My professor was St. Clair Drake, and I used to look at him talking, and I would say, oh, I don't want to be like that when I get that age. Well, I'm at that age, and I tend to do that. So just tell me your time is up, and I'll stop. Thank you. I'm going to talk about what I teach about race, racism, and anti-racism, and why. While the scholarship of race includes useful examinations of epistemological ignorance that help to maintain the hierarchical racial contract, I also find it useful in my teaching and in my research to emphasize racism as a form of knowledge and to demystify conceptual whiteness as the alter ego of conceptual Blackness. I do this by historicizing these ideas and beliefs. Paraphrasing Carter G. Woodson, there would never have been any lynching in the street if it did not first take place in the classroom. And following Sylvia Wynter, who has said, the question we have been running away from is the body of knowledge in the university and the schools itself. So I've done a lot of work with textbook bias in my career as a teacher educator as well as a researcher. A question came in prior to this session from a teacher who asked, how should I teach my white students about slavery? What should they be learning about Africa? And my response to that teacher, and there may be other teachers with us this afternoon with similar questions. I said, that's a good place to start. Certainly following Baba Asa, we do not start our story with slavery. I indicated that students and teachers should be able to look critically at the representations of people who have fought against slavery, representations in school knowledge. For example, how is Emperor Sani Ali Bear from the Songhai Empire represented? In the historiography, he's represented as bloodthirsty. Well, he was actually fighting against slavery. Same with Queen Nzinga. How is she represented? And I also remind my students to go and look at how John Brown is represented in the textbooks. He's always made to look like some insane person. And my point is that we are all harmed by these systems of knowledge. I coined the term disconscious racism, DYS, disconscious racism, like dysfunctional. In 1991, when I was director of teacher education in California, and I created this term based upon research I did with teachers, asking them to explain, how did our society get to be this way? And they all said, oh, it's slavery. It's just a result of slavery. However, I define the concept as an uncritical habit of mind, including perceptions, attitudes, assumptions, and beliefs. And I documented the way that these teachers could only think of inequity as something inevitable and natural, a quality of human nature. So disconsciousness is a form of knowledge that is the result of miseducation. It justifies inequity and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things as given. It is not unconscious, but it is rather an ideological commitment to seeing the world in a particular way. And when my students would say that to me, I would respond to them, well, you're giving me the George Clinton Funkadelic Parliament theory of humanity, the song Atomic Dog. Why must I feel like that? Why must I chase the cat? It's just the dog in me. In other words, we don't have anything to do as educators because it's inevitable and it's human nature. So in my teaching about race, racism, and anti-racism, we don't start with enslavement in Africa. We go back to Europe and look at enslavement as a human experience. And I'm just going to refer briefly to an article that I published. It was a special issue on 45. I call him 45. I don't call his name. And the article is titled, "Who Will Make America Great Again? Black People, of Course." And that's from an Amiri Baraka poem. But in this article, I talk about how I teach about race, racism, and anti-racism. And I actually developed a timeline, a teaching tool, and you can see it in the article. And we start at 711. We look at the African Moors in Spain and the civilization that they brought. And we talk about the enslavement of the people who became Europeans by the Vikings. And then I take them down from 711 to 1066, all the way to the 1180s. And I'll just finish with this quote from my timeline in this article. This is something that was written by Gerald of Wales, who came into Ireland with the British colonizers. And he said of the Irish people, "The Irish are a rude people subsisting on the produce of their cattle only and living themselves like beasts, a people that has not yet departed from the primitive habits of pastoral life, neither willing to give up their old habits or learn anything new, abandoning themselves to idleness and immersed in sloth. Their greatest delight is to be exempt from toil." It goes on. And I remind my students that this was the perception of the Irish people by the colonizing British before any of them became white, before they came to the New World. And then we can come on down and see some of those same people who were colonized and abused coming to the New World, abusing and implementing whiteness on top of African descent people. So what is my point? This notion of race is an idea, a belief system. It's a part of our cultural model that we live in. It is not just here, it's global. And in order to free ourselves of it, we need to historicize it, know where it came from, and be able to analyze how it is working now in the knowledge that we look to prepare us. And it was Walter Rodney who said how painful it is to discover that the very knowledge that you look to misrepresents and abuses you. So let me stop there. I hope I'm giving some other people some time.
Thank you very much. You know, I applaud you, appreciate you very much. At this time, our next speaker is Dr. Amari Johnson, who is Assistant Professor of Africology at Temple University. He's a cultural scholar and educator and author of the forthcoming A Curious Celestial Phenomenon, Maroonage and Community in New Orleans. Dr. Amari Johnson, welcome.
Hey, Dr. Asante, thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here, to be able to share some thoughts, and I am committing to staying within my time. So I want to begin by acknowledging the ancestors, in particular the spirit of Baba Malcolm X and Nana Harriet Tubman, who should guide us in all that we do. I want to say that the problem and the root of the problem is not that police kill Black people. The problem is that Black people do not have the power to stop police from killing us. So we're living in a time where the contradictions of American society have been heightened, and there is a much broader conversation happening around the world. And for some, this is an encouraging sign that change may indeed be on the horizon. We have elected officials who are engaging in discussions that reveal possibilities that were impossible just a few short weeks ago. Corporations with no prior interest are releasing statements of support with a dizzying rapidity, pledging tax-deductible donations to organizations they've decided represent Black interests. Even professional sports leagues find it opportune to make complete 180s on previously bullheaded stances that outwardly deny the lived realities of its most prized possessions, and that is its Black athletes. Placing all of this within a broader context, it becomes clear that the wage of change is Black death. Kwame Ture would often point out that any so-called advance for African people in this society came with the shedding of our blood, and we have all no doubt seen the video of George Floyd's daughter proclaiming, "My daddy changed the world." So my concern is when the news cycle shifts and the national conversation moves on, what will we, Black people, have to show for it? A holiday or increased sensitivity trainings at our workplaces that place the burden of explanation on us and in the process create more uncompensated emotional labor? I want to offer this. The problem is not that police kill Black people. The problem is that Black people do not have the power to stop police from killing us. So to suggest that the root of the problem is that police kill Black people is to ignore the overwhelming history of the origin of the institution of policing, from patrollers of escaping Africans to private forces hired to protect property. Furthermore, and this is the true error, it is ultimately to place our appeals in a moral universe where our fate is decided by the moral inclinations of a system that has demonstrated itself to have no such inclinations. Despite some of our desires for the opposite, the system of Americanism has been remarkably consistent. Demands for anything outside of that are based in the captivating and crippling myth of American democracy. The true problem is that Black people, we do not have the power to stop police from killing us, and I'm looking at Amos Wilson here with his explorations of the various expressions of power. We often talk about one of the key components necessary for racism is power itself. So again, Amos Wilson would tell us white people practice racism because they have the power to do so. This would imply that they could just as well decide not to practice racism, but either way, our well-being is tied to the decisions of others, how they choose to use their power. So the question becomes, how do we build power? And I really wish that I had a nice, neat answer for you and we could just be done with it. I'll tell you right now, I do not. And furthermore, I really don't think that any answer coming from one individual could be anything less than insufficient. I do, however, have an avenue I think could prove useful, and that is an emphasis on community autonomy, particularly through the development of institutions. Community here is not used in the nebulous sense of an abstract group of people sharing assumed common goals. Instead, I'm talking about community in the very localized sense of people making use of collective resources, broadly defined to meet shared objectives. Community autonomy, then, as Roberto Flores tells us, includes the ability to take independent, organized initiative on social, cultural, economic, educational, and political affairs. And I have to emphasize the local nature of this. This is by no means a quick or easy solution. It takes time and really shifts from an external focus, police stop killing us, to an internal focus. What can we make happen to the police if they continue to kill us? I hope you catch what seems to be a slight nuance, but in fact represents a monumental shift in both focus and approach. So in my book, A Curious Celestial Phenomenon, I offer a case study of this with the Black Star community in New Orleans, Louisiana, which was really centered around two institutions, Black Star Books and Cafe, which was a bookstore and a cafe, and Kamali Academy, which is an independent African-centered homeschool collective. It's just a few short years after Hurricane Katrina, in the midst of a serious land grab that either kept exiled Black New Orleanians away from the city or forced those still in the city out into the suburbs. Also within the midst of a very ravenous charter school takeover, a group of people came together to build a world for themselves and make a practice out of Black self-determination. For the purposes of today, I'd like to use Flores's initiatives of community autonomy to explore the work of Black Star, that is socially, culturally, economically, educationally, and politically. So socially and culturally, both the school, Kamali, and the bookstore, Black Star, were places where an African identity was the assumption. Through our art, our music, our discussion, our debate, we were actively seeking to rediscover and explore what that both meant and what it could mean. Economically, what becomes significant here is not the business model of Black Star Books and Cafe or the school. What Amos Wilson emphasized that an economy is really just a series of relationships. So in this sense, money was not the primary currency. Bartering, the sharing of time, skills, trades, or other resources was a common practice. People often used the network to search for and provide employment, and additionally, savings groups such as SUSUs were a common practice. Educationally, Kamali was tailoring its philosophies and pedagogical approaches to the needs of the community. So as Julius Nyerere would ask about the nascent Tanzania, before we can ask what kind of education we want, we have to first ask what kind of society do we want. Now, Kamali really took this to heart, engaging in constant conversations with parents, with students, with community members about life goals that extended far beyond test scores. And let me also clarify that when we're talking about Kamali as a homeschool collective, I'm not talking about homeschool in the current COVID moment, which is really just a frenzied response to an already failed system on so many levels. I'm also not talking about a model of homeschooling that has as its ultimate intent the re-engaging into white institutions, right? This is an intentional homeschooling about cultivating a true community autonomy. And the final of Flores's community autonomy initiatives is politically, right? Politically speaking, how are you working towards this? And I just want to provide with you one point, and that is police officers came to Black Star, right? We all have friends or went to school with people or worked with people who went on to become police officers. Police officers came to Black Star, but what's significant is they never came in uniform. At the very least, they knew that that was a line they would not cross. They would show respect for the institution as it was, and they would not come in their uniforms. Now, I'd like to be very clear. This discussion on institutions is not about creating a mirror society of white institutions in blackface. I'm talking about cultivating the ability to leverage the resources of our institutions, that we build autonomous institutions so that when we do engage with the broader society, which we will inevitably have to do as long as we remain here, we do so from a place of power. We don't ask anyone for anything. Instead, we set the terms of our engagement. That is power. Now, 10 minutes, and I think I'm doing better than 10 minutes. 8 minutes is not enough time to provide more than a sketch of a sketch, but I would like to invite you to join this conversation about alternative models of community building and creating for ourselves the change a decadent system is incapable of providing. Community autonomy and institution building is one way that we can develop the power to not only stop police from killing us, but to also be able to build for ourselves the world that we desire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. And I just would like to ask here if those of you whose mics are unmuted, if you would mute your microphones, please do that. Just look at your microphone and make sure that it is muted so that our speakers can be heard without the sounds in the background. Really appreciate that. So at this time, we're going to move on to our next presenter, who actually is a very good and close friend of mine, Dr. Maulana Karenga, who is professor and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at Cal State Long Beach, California State University Long Beach, the leading theorist of culture and change, perhaps the most consequential African-American philosopher in terms of having more impact on the society, on the African-American society than anyone I know of in the last 50 years. We still use terminologies that come out of the Swahili language, Kiswahili language that he gave us in the 1960s. We still have organizations that are named for, like Harambe, for example, Ujima, Umoja, that come out of his thought. He's the author of Ma'at, The Moral Ideal in Ancient Egypt, and he also wrote the first introduction to Black studies in the field of Black studies. And as a founder of Kwanzaa, he has become a global figure. At this time, we're going to ask him if he would, and he's my brother, he understands, if he could stay within 10 minutes.
Asante Sana, Badigani, on behalf of my organization, us and the advocates would like to say, Asante, we send you greetings of solidarity. We wish for you blessings without number and all good things without end. And we bear witness as an African people that as our beginning was great and good, so shall our development throughout eternity be, if we dare struggle, speak truth, do justice, and walk in the way of rightness. Hotep, Ashe, Heri. Let me start by saying Asante Sana. Thanks very much to Professor Molefi Asante for bringing us all together to discuss these critical issues confronting us in this time of turmoil and turning. It is a critical juncture in our history of our historical struggle for liberation in this country. And thus it is part of all the revolts and rebellions, all the strivings and struggle before us. Ferguson can rightly be noticed as the new turn, the kind of spark that ignited these forest fires. And these transformative fires have reached around the world and reaffirmed our need to continue to struggle to create the good world we all want and deserve to live in. The transformative fires and formations of revolt and rebellion have reached, I repeat, around the world in rightful resistance to police violence against Black men, women, and children, and against a system of savage racism which fosters it, facilitates it, and sanctions it at virtually every level of social life. And so we pay homage to George Ford, Breonna Taylor, and all the others, martyrs among countless martyrs, whose brutal murders have brought us to the time of turning in our long and life-honoring struggle against police violence and against racism and for racial justice and liberation. And we should remember it is a larger struggle that must always be kept in mind. Otherwise, we'll assume a battle we win is the end of the struggle and leave the system intact. For make no mistake, killer cops are not acting without assumed and constant approval and regular vindication by the system they serve when they are put on trial for degrading, disabling, and murdering violence. Thus, it is the system itself, the system of racism and racist violence that must be dismantled, radically reimagined and rebuilt in dignity-affirming, life-enhancing, and world-preserving ways. Therefore, training, civilizing them, defunding them, and even the dismantling of the police force is but one side of the overall struggle against the various forms of racial and human oppression that need to be overcome and ended. This is a dangerous, difficult, and demanding time, which requires our best minds, our best ideas and practices as a people, as we wage this struggle against the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pathology of oppression. At the heart of this pathology of oppression is its various form, is the radical evil of racism, which informs and affects every other form of oppression, whether it is class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, etc. To define racism as a radical evil is to indicate its morally monstrous history, which ranges from domination to decimation, from daily injustice to genocide, and from systemic exclusion to the Holocaust of enslavement. Also, it is to stress racism's deep-rootedness in the conception and history of America. Indeed, it is grotesquely present at the very founding of the country and received consideration in its Constitution and found life in its laws, comfort in its courts, chosen people status in its churches, and pseudo-intellectual support from its learned men and universities. And so we stand here talking about racism, for of all the evil and violent psychological and social disorders that can infect the people and that have affected the history and lives of the peoples of the world, few rival racism in its destructive impact. Indeed, the horrid history of racism in this country began again with its founding, with the Holocaust of genocide and dispossession against the Native Americans, the Holocaust of enslavement against Africans, violent dispossession and subjugation of Mexicans, and the brutal labor exploitation and oppression of Asians. Racism has many forms and faces. For example, white supremacy or white nationalism. But racism by any other name is racist ideology of white superiority, racial segregation, white dominance, and hatred, and violence toward them. And white nationalism is nothing but white supremacy camouflaged for public consumption and should be thus called so. Racism expresses itself in three basic ways: imposition, ideology, and institutional arrangement. Racism begins as imposition, an act of massive violence, and continues this violence in various forms. That's why we must make a distinction between racial prejudice, which is an attitude of hatred and hostility toward different, and racism, which is turning that hatred and hostility into public policy and socially sanctioned practice. And that practice, again, is an imposition of violence. Second is ideological justification for the violence of domination, deprivation, and degradation. And it is also, finally, institutional arrangement. By institutional arrangement, that means structures and practices which preserve and promote the imposition and ideology of racism. Schools and universities, the courts, the media, legislature, police department, intelligence service, corporations, and even churches are structured for white dominance, deprivation, and degradation, in a word, Black disadvantage and destruction. We come to this point not only as survivors, though, of colonialism, imperialism, and the Holocaust of enslavement, and centuries of apartheid, racism, and white supremacy, but also as seasoned soldiers, resolute, resilient, and resourceful. And we also injured physicians with the knowledge, skill, and will, not only to heal, repair, and renew ourselves, but also to play a decisive role with other oppressed and struggling peoples in repairing, renewing, and remaking the world. For as our foremother, McLeod Bethune said, this is our task. Our task is to remake the world. It is nothing less than this. The social and moral map then of America and its social contract can only be rightly reconceived and redrawn and rewritten in righteous and relentless struggle. And I speak here within the framework of Cognitive philosophy, which has the concept of our people having a history and culture of righteous and relentless struggle. Malcolm X, our forefather, teaches us that wherever Black people are, there's a battlefield. And if there's a battlefield, there's also a call for struggle. And therefore, one of our mottos of our organization is everywhere a battle line, every day a call to struggle. The alternative to this in redefining the social contract is, number one, that we reconceive the society not as a white finished product, but as an unfinished, ongoing multicultural project. And by multiculturalism, I don't mean celebrating ethnic foods, fashion, and food fashion and festival. I mean, number one, mutual respect for each people as a unique and culture, as a unique and equally valid and valuable way of being human in the world. Second, mutual respect for each people and their right to and responsibility to speak their own special culture truth, make their own unique contribution to how this society is reconceived and reconstructed. Third, mutual commitment to the constant search for common ground in the midst of our diversity, and mutual commitment to an ethics of sharing. Next, we must maintain our own agency, remain at the center of our own history and struggle. Indeed, as Kawhi teaches, our struggle has always been, from the beginning, a struggle to be ourselves and free ourselves, because we can't be ourselves unless we free ourselves, but we can't even start to free ourselves until we be ourselves. So let's not get all excited and pretend that white people newly arrived and that that's the most important part in our history. If Black people hadn't stood up, white people couldn't stand. If Black people hadn't stood up, white people wouldn't have showed up. And so we have to keep in mind, we must be the subject of our own history, the agent. We must engage the central issues of freedom and justice, power of the masses, human rights, reparations, economic initiative, housing, healthcare, just immigration policy, war and peace, environmental justice and care, mass incarceration, death penalty, egalitarian distribution of wealth and power, self-determination for all people, and the end of racism. And in this context of the pathology of oppression, there is no real and effective remedy except resistance, righteous, radical, and relentless resistance. There is no strategy worthy of note or its name that does not prioritize privilege and promote struggle at every level. And there is no rightful or promising way forward except in unity in the moral and social interests of African people, human good, and the well-being of the world. I close by saying, this is our duty as ever, to know our past and honor it, to engage our present and improve it, and to imagine a whole new future and to forge it in the most ethical, effective, and expansive ways. Asante.
Asante Sana, Dr. Maulana Karenga. Appreciate your thoughts. And I'm gonna take a minute here and see whether or not we have any questions that might be out there from the audience. We have over 800 and we have 899 people watching the webinar. Over 1,200 had registered, but there may be some questions, and I'm waiting to receive questions from Taharka. And if I receive those questions, I will see if we can take time to answer them. But while he's getting that together, I'm going to go to our next presenter, who is Dr. Melina Abdullah. Is Dr. Madula here? Dr. Melina Abdullah Abdullah is Professor and Chair, Department of Pan-African Studies at California State University, Los Angeles. She's a major scholar activist and co-founder of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles chapter. So Dr. Abdullah, I don't see her. Anyone see? Okay, well, we now can take questions. Apparently Dr. Abdullah is not here. I do not see Dr. Abdullah. Okay, so we now can pause and take a couple of questions, and I will ask these questions. I'm going to look for them. I think they're in chat. Let's see here. No, I don't have questions. So let's go to our next presenter. We will go to our next presenter, and then if we have, I see a note here that there are 35 questions, but I don't seem to have them here. So I'm going to ask Dr. Kemet Shockley. Dr. Shockley is a professor of education at Howard University. He's a major Afrocentric educator and scholar, and he's the author of the books, The Miseducation of Black Children and African-Centered Education, Theory and Practice. Dr. Kemet Shockley, you have 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Asante, for the invitation, and thank you to the Department of Africology at Temple University, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in to listen to these ideas in a very, very important time for us in African history. I want to just start off by asking you to say something in Tree, even if you're at home alone. Say, Ye wo okumu, in your home. Ye wo okumu, in Tree, means we are at war. Ye wo okumu. My definition of racism is in full agreement with Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, that racism is white supremacy, which is also white terror. And as Baba Kamal Kambone says, we are in a nasty, hate-filled cesspool. So he says that this is the culture of the cesspoolian. But in addition, I see this as not just being racism, but as a war and terrorism against Black people. Ye wo okumu. The reason why it can be a difficult thing to articulate is because it is the only thing that's happening all day, every day. Ye wo okumu. The very beginnings of European interloperism can be traced back to ancient Kemet, that's ancient Egypt. The war that they've waged against us goes against Ma'at. the system of truth, justice, balance, order. It goes against the creator. It goes against the ancestors. War life in this society is so prevalent that it's like a fish trying to describe water. We're completely submerged in war all day long. It's 24/7, 365. Oftentimes we don't fight back. Yet we have an enemy that doesn't take any breaks. And we have irreconcilable differences with our enemy. But we are in trouble because many of us love our enemy more than we love ourselves. Yet okomu. We like to take breaks from the war. And when we decide to take a break, we don't understand how we leave other Black people vulnerable and dangerously exposed. We've got a lot of people out on long breaks like Ben Carson. I don't know what happened to gifted hands and Black History Month celebrations around Ben Carson. We've got some people who've never shown up to work like Clarence Thomas. We've got some people who you wish wouldn't come to work like Oprah and Gail, and others who are actually at work on the plantation with the enemy like Candace Owens. Yet we're okomu. But it's invigorating to see the younger people working hard to bring our issues to the human table to ask for global help with those who want to choke us out and make laws that choke entire communities, and other cesspoolians who schizophrenically want to either call the cops on you or hurriedly throw on a negligee and try to get with you. How on earth do we deal effectively with the white woman? Yeah, we're okomu. Luckily, we do have a model of excellence in our elders. One of our elders that I want to show you a picture of is Kwame Aje Akoto, for the work that he did during the time that he was alive on the planet. He started an African-centered school, and he was also able to start an African-centered, if you look at your screen, you'll see a picture of Kwame Aje Akoto. Just a second, there it is. He started an African-centered school, and he also has started an African-centered think tank. And I am a proud member, a graduate of that think tank, if you will. Yewo Okomu. I also want to show you a book that Dr. Kofi Lamodi and I have done. This book is called African-Centered Education, Theory and Practice, now available on Amazon. In that book, we talk about some of the most important concepts that we need so that we can get ourselves back on track and so that we can use our greatest weapon that we have in our struggle. And that greatest weapon is Afrocentric education. Many of our elders, brothers, and sisters that are on this call have made a great contribution to that book. And I want to take a second to thank them publicly for their contribution. Yewo Okomu. We do this work because the best tool we have in this race war is Afrocentric education, and we must make our youth unavailable to the cesspool of so-called pop culture. African-centered education is us intentionally and systematically preparing our youth to solve problems in our community. Some non-Afrocentric thinkers cause problems for us in education. Many of them see Black children through the same lens as those who terrorize us. Right now, Black children score lowest both nationally and locally on all of the Eurocentric measures gathered by the National Center on Education Statistics. While there is no history of failure in African-centered schools, there's only a history of success. But since white education terrorists haven't acknowledged African-centered education, neither do many Black researchers, and it's hurting us tremendously. We are in a war. Yewo Okomu. The war we are in is with the white supremacists, white culture, white ways of knowing and being, white ideals and notions, white language, and we're at war with conceptions of a white God, and we're at war with conceptions of a white devil. We fight against white terror best, and we shore up the social contract between one another in the Black community best by engaging in a process of Sankofa, going back and fetching that which we left on the continent and making sure that what we fetch has utility for us wherever we happen to be in the world. Asante Sana.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much for that presentation, Dr. Kemet. And I do have a few questions that have been asked. And before we go to Dr. Melina Abdullah, I'm going to see whether or not I'm going to call on Dr. Nadab if she's still here to answer the question Janet Chong has asked, and that is the social contract the United States Constitution? When we talk about redefining the social contract, could you just give us your statement about the social contract, a part of this discussion?
That's a question for me, Dr. Asante?
Well, I thought it was a question for Dr. Dove because she had done stuff on, but I don't see her on here. So,
I'm here.
Oh, you are? Okay, Dr.
Yeah.
No,
And I haven't got a lot to say on it because of time constraints and everything, but it's essentially developed in Europe during the Enlightenment period in the 1700s, where white men came together to discuss how they could move forward in thinking and enabling people, how governments and people should react to each other, how people could be controlled, but at the same time, some kind of freedom.
Turn the mic up.
Sorry? Is this any better?
Yes, it's better, Dr. Dove, but Dr. Shockley, could you stop sharing your screen? All right. And then Dr. Dove, if you would speak a little up a little bit, that would be very helpful. We are now getting Dr. Shockley. It should be at the top of your screen. It says stop sharing.
Okay, just one second. Yeah. There it is.
Did you want?
Okay, there you go. Now, Dr. Dove, go right ahead.
Well, it's the idea of the social contract. I'm saying social construct. But the idea of the contract is evolved in the Enlightenment period in the 1700s, when white men came together during a time of the enslavement of African people and talked about their own humanity and their relationship with government. So the social contract is a way of having a relationship where the government is controlling, but you are not enslaved to the government. So in the discussions that they had, they omitted people of African descent who were being enslaved at that time. So, and some of the principles from that contract are ensconced in the American contract.
Okay, that's a very good, thank you very much. There's another question. And this question, Dr. Maulana Karinga, they're asking, do you think creating jobs around security patrol with cultural education as training would be helpful? That is, creating some jobs around a security patrol in the African American community, and also cultural education coming out of the community, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, but appreciate what you said, if I'm saying correctly. These things like this proposed have to be proposed and dealt with in the, of course, yes, the answer is yes, but with these understanding. So this has to be posed in the context of reimagining public safety and policing. So the reality is that our organization, us, which means us African people, started the whole idea of a community alert patrol, in which we managed and went and checked on police, make sure people weren't abused, got lawyers for them, and also taught them self-defense. So we could do that, but we have to have common agreement. And we had a movement to work with. So we have to rebuild this overarching movement in a context in which this is discussed and put together. But we can't see it outside of a larger understanding of the radical reconstruction and reconception of this society itself. So yes, we need to reconceive our community and how we want to do safety and how we want to do policing.
Okay, Dr. Karenga, thank you. There's another question directly for you from Sister Chimbuko. Where do we go from here in the struggle?
Oh, appreciate what you said. We have to intensify, expand, and continue the struggle. That's what we have to do. We have to build Black United Front because we have to share this struggle and we have to talk. We have to keep our project in our own hands. We must maintain Black leadership. We must give all of our allies credit, not just white people, but Native Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And we have to have a particular and a universal agenda because we always get lost when we have those general agendas. That's why I ended by saying we have to have a struggle that focuses on the moral and social interests of African people, human good, and the well-being of the world. So a particular and a universal agenda thought out, but also refined in struggle.
All right, thank you. Dr. Johnson, this is from Maria. How can we disseminate your model of Black self-sufficiency throughout the country and the world?
Thank you very much. Locally, this is not, I think the idea of mass movements certainly have their place, but they must be connected to smaller cells that are operating throughout the country and indeed throughout the world. One of my sort of main points of emphasis is always that, is in the words of Baba Malcolm, if we continue to look at ourselves as confined to this country, our identity, our sense of personhood, as confined strictly to the borders of this country, we will always lose. So what that means in terms of this question is our ability to organize locally, to build with the people on the very blocks that we live on, and then sort of grow out from there. Again, the emphasis of my comments was really on the idea of a shift to the internal. We must build amongst ourselves, within our communities, and then take it out from there.
Thank you very much. Dr. King, if Dr. Joyce King, Wonder has asked you to give us the name of your article cited in your talk.
It's posted in the chat. I put both of them.
You put it in the chat.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we have close to 80 questions. We can't go through all of them. What I've done is picked out the questions that people have asked specifically to certain speakers, and now we're ready to continue with our 10-minute presentations by our next speaker. Our next speaker is actually Dr. Melina Abdullah, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State, Los Angeles. She's a major scholar activist, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Los Angeles, and a very significant voice in the social and political struggles going on in the United States at this time. And so we welcome Dr. Melina Abdullah. You can unmute and you're on.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be in this space. So many of those who are doing just incredible work in our intellectual work are here. Dr. Dove, I've never met you, but you've been hugely influential to my thinking and were integral to my dissertation many moons ago. And so I'm excited to see you on this webinar, and of course, Dr. Asante, Dr. Karenga, and many others. I appreciate sharing this space. Dr. Karenga and I share space every single Wednesday morning, early in the morning, remembering that the work that we do is absolutely, on our campuses, intellectual work, but it also, our tradition, the reason that we're in Black studies, Pan-African studies, Africana studies, is because our work is meant to be an intellectual piece of a revolutionary movement. It's meant to be a part of Black freedom struggle, not separate from it. And so the space that we share on Wednesday mornings is about pulling in people from different spaces that do Black freedom work to talk about how to move that forward. And so I just want to kind of ground us in that. So my space, and the reason I'm just rushing back and was on the wrong part of the Zoom a few minutes ago, I was in the attendees space when you were calling for me, Dr. Asante. So I had to figure it out that I had to jump on a different link. So I'm glad to be here and have found the right link now. But the reason I was rushing and wasn't able to be on from the beginning is because we're in the midst of a huge battle. And everyone on here knows that we are in a moment of struggle. And I think one of the most significant moments of struggle of my lifetime, certainly, we are in a moment when the world has cracked wide open. Many of us who've been in this work for some time, many of us who've been doing Black Lives Matter work and work before Black Lives Matter around police abolition, prison abolition, and the fundamental reimagining of public safety and reimagining of the world have accepted our space as abolitionists, right? We understand that abolition means not just the tearing down of fundamentally unjust, oppressive, racist, white supremacist systems, but also imagining what we'd have and working towards building something else in their stead. And so this morning, I was at the Los Angeles School Board meeting offering public comment as they consider whether or not to defund their police. Defunding the police has become this clarion call of the moment, which is also coupled with reimagining public safety, right? That we understand that the system of policing in this country, and I don't have to explain it to those who were already on the call, but we know that the system of policing in this country evolves from slave catching. It is a vestige of chattel slavery. And as ridiculous as it would be to say, let's simply reform slavery, reform chattel slavery, that's the same kind of ridiculousness when people say we can tinker around the edges of policing. We cannot reform a system that intentionally and deliberately puts a target on the backs of Black people. So it wasn't an accident that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. It wasn't an accident that Breonna Taylor was murdered in Louisville. It wasn't an accident that former police and white supremacists murdered Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. It's not an accident that we're talking about the murders of mothers and fathers like Kenneth Ross Jr. and Riddell Jones, and children like Afro-Latino Jesse Romero, who was only 14 years old when LAPD murdered him in 2016, and AJ Weber, who was 16 years old when LA County sheriffs murdered him as he was leaving a Super Bowl party. Those are not accidents. It's because the police are deliberately designed to put targets on the backs of Black people. And so just like we had to seek to abolish chattel slavery, our foremothers and forefathers had to seek to abolish chattel slavery, we also have to abolish police. Now it seems that we're in a moment when the world is catching up, but 5 years ago when we were talking about and thinking about how to make conversation around police and prison abolition resonate with the masses of folks, we began to think about how to get at them through their budgets. Someone handed me a pie chart of the LA City budget that showed upwards of 50% of our city's general fund was going to LAPD. And so we began to chant defund the police, and we're thinking about scholars like Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who often raises that, budgets are a statement of our morals and priorities. And so it's important that we get to budgets. So we began chanting, defund the police, thinking it would be more palatable to the masses of people than police abolition. Never did we imagine that 5 years later, that would be the clarion call of the moment, of the movement. But that's what we're calling for. And I realize that 10 minutes is getting away from me. So let me just say what that looks like for us and what we want to implore intellectuals to do. One, what that looks like is demanding that police be defunded in our own locales, demanding that, like Minneapolis, we think about disbanding, we move to disband policing as we know it. Also recognizing, and we've launched several studies, that most Black people, when we say they've done a really good job of socializing us into thinking that we need police, right? But most Black people can actually get what we mean when we say defund police when you couple it with reimagining public safety. Most Black people grew up in neighborhoods like mine where we had kind of a tendency to engage in abolitionist practice, where we didn't call the police on each other. When I was a little girl, Miss Rose was the neighborhood disciplinarian, and I won't say much more about that, but that she did a very good job of keeping young people like me and my brother and all of the many children who lived in East Oakland in line, and then would tell our parents what we did when she was away, right? So my mother would discipline us after Miss Rose disciplined us. That's a way of reimagining public safety. And when we talk about this with our community members, they understand it. So it's really important that we talk about defunding the police in that context, that we want to defund the police and we want to reimagine public safety by building Black community. The second thing that I think is really important to do is to think about spaces of abolition that resonate well with people. So I'm coming back from school board because one of the things that's resonating well with people is that if there is one place police do not belong, it is in our schools, right? And so we all remember, and I was born in Oakland in the 70s, that still makes me 29, so don't let the math fool you. But in Oakland in the 70s and coming of age in the 90s, I remember that there were no police in schools. So this isn't a far-reaching expectation that when we remove police from schools, and I'd love for some of the educational scholars to chime in on this, but we know that the children who are targeted in schools are overwhelmingly Black. This is what we talk about when we talk about school to prison pipelines. In California schools, 8% of the student population is Black. 25% of the ones who have run-ins with police are Black, right? So it is Black people who are bearing the brunt of it. It's Black children who are bearing the brunt of it. And so we need to make schools places of abolition. And those of us who are in higher education, I think we can also call on our universities to become sites of abolition, sites of space where we actually nurture Black students rather than traumatizing and terrorizing them with armed police on campuses. And I think that there's a lot of work that's been done. I think about the work of people like Monique Morris and others who have written about what it means to have a school to prison pipeline in our K through 12 system, but also what it means on our university campuses. And then I'll just end by saying that all of us have spaces of power. And if there's not spaces where you can create immediate institutional change, we need to think about our roles as thought leaders in kind of pushing the envelope and engaging, not being afraid to engage in radical imagining in our work and let that work translate over to systems, as well as our private and independent spaces. And so the last thing that I'll say is that our homes and collectives can also be spaces of abolition. In my home, for example, we have an absolutely zero tolerance policy for police. So anything that happens in my home, my children have another plan of what to do. You know, we have for instance, my plan is my neighbor is the fire chief or one of the fire chiefs. If something happens, they know to call him. He will dispatch fire, but never call 911 because we never know what will happen when police come out. So I think, again, that this is a moment when, as Dr. Karenga pointed to, that, you know, we are radically reimagining the world. That's one of the hashtags of Black Lives Matter, reimagine public safety. But I think beyond that, radically reimagine the world. And this is an opportunity for us to courageously usher in the world in which we want to live.
Thank you very much, Dr. Melina Abdullah, and we appreciate that very much, presentation that you've given. And we now will turn to Dr. Kimani Nehusi, who is an associate professor at Temple University. He's a major chematologist and cultural historian, the author of the important book, Libation, an African Ritual of Heritage in the Circle of Life, and many other articles and books, including A People's History of Guyana. At this time, Dr. Kimani Nehusi. But
We can't hear him.
we're trying to get Dr. Nehusi to unmute himself. He has? Okay, we're going to move to the next one while he figures that out. Okay. We'll come back to Dr. Nehusi. Dr. Nehusi, can you hear me? You can hear me, but we can't hear you. So look at your machine and see if you can unmute yourself. Okay. Oh. Okay. All right. The next, we'll come back to Dr. Nehusi. The next presenter is Dr. Ama Mazama, who is a professor and graduate director at Temple University in the Department of Africology, the Perat of Afrocentricity International, the author of many books, including The Afrocentric Paradigm, and the co-editor of the Journal of Black Studies. Dr. Ama Mazama.
Hotep.
Hotep.
Can you hear me? You can hear me well,
yes,
right?
we can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me and being part of this great discussion. I'm with you from Guadeloupe, and so I would like to share some of my understanding as reflected, by the people who surround me who don't necessarily know the U.S. very well. But I want to say that as I watched the unbearable murder of George Floyd, like many of my people here in Guadeloupe, I could not help thinking that there was nothing truly new about the atrocious treatment of Black people in the hands of white people. And I could not help thinking about the hundreds of thousands of Black lives taken mercilessly, of Black bodies dismembered, mutilated, raped, castrated, burned, and hung during slavery and then Jim Crow, not just in the United States, but in the Caribbean, in South America, in Africa, in Australia. And I wondered, like many, if this injustice would ever end. since this white man was caught red-handed, cold-bloodedly killing a black man in broad daylight, there have been many demonstrations in the world. And as I said, here in Guadeloupe, there have been several demonstrations of solidarity. And in places where Afrocentricity International operates, many demonstrations were organized as well. And of course, this is all good and necessary. But what is not so good, in my opinion, is that the main remedy suggested has been to reform the police. And several of my colleagues have mentioned this already. And some talk even about dismantling or defunding the police to, make the police less dangerous to Black people. And it seems to me that, as always, what is proposed is to place a bandage on a deep wound in order to avoid getting to the heart of the problem. So is the police the problem, or is the worldview that allows a minority of people who call themselves white to abuse the majority of the people in the world? In my opinion, what we need to examine very seriously and very closely is the white psyche and the culture produced by that psyche. This is where the problem lies. Focusing solely on the police is avoiding looking at the root of the problem. And here, of course, I'm thinking about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's analysis and notion that white people act out of fear and jealousy, and that as much as they claim that our lives are worth nothing to them, this is just a cover for their envy. How else would we explain so many, behaviors? And so, again, in my opinion, it's not the police that needs to be reformed, but white people altogether. And where I am, many mentioned to me that they saw many white people participating in demonstrations, and they took this to mean that the problem was not white racism. But I had to point out to them that those white people probably participated out of guilt, and that if they were sincere, then what those white people need to do is engage in collective self-introspection and ask themselves very honestly, why it is the case that wherever they have been in the world, they have spread death and chaos. George Floyd was just another victim of their deadly culture. And unless we have a proper understanding of the people who have been abusing us, our efforts will remain limited. And unless we stop seeking their approval, we will fail to protect ourselves properly. Unless we stop seeking the approval or being saved by their white God, we will remain doomed. And unless also we listen to what Marcus Garvey taught us many years ago, that we are at war, like Brother Kemet Shockley mentioned earlier, we will be doomed. And so Marcus Garvey recommended that we build our own institutions in order to gain power and autonomy. And this is the purpose for which Afrocentricity International was created in 2011 as a grassroots and vanguard organization. And I will end here by inviting you, all of you that are listening to us, to join our organization to be a part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amamazama, for your presentation. And that brings us to ask the question to Dr. Nehusi. Dr. Nehusi, can you hear me?
I'm hearing you. Are you hearing me?
And we're hearing you. Okay. Now we go back to Dr. Nehusi. Dr. Nehusi, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Santi. Let me begin by affirming my allegiance to all our ancestors in struggle, beginning with those before Imhotep, but mentioning Imhotep, a scholar warrior that we know about as the first multi-genius in the history of our planet. It is these ancestors who are the nations for our presence. We're here because they are here, and we continue the work and the struggles of those ancestors. So power to our ancestors, with whose permission I speak today. This presentation is entitled White Racism and European Expansion, a history of the last 600 years of planet Earth, or a history of this moment that we inhabit when we've come together to discuss things in these ways. Let me emphasize what other people have said. It's a very peculiar moment that we meet in. And as we discuss what we're discussing, let us resolve that these shouldn't only be discussions that are aimless. Let us have discussions where we listen to the stories, the experiences, the perspectives of each other, so that we're better armed to make important interventions in a resolute attempt at changing things. We must prioritize intelligent action coming out of our discussion. Now, one of the most significant developments over the last 600 years of planet Earth is the rise of Western Europeans, the domination over large parts of the world, and especially the material prosperity that is a consequence of that domination. Of course, we must be clear that there were many other peoples who established long-reigning civilizations with great advances in the history of the world. First, with African people, the Chinese, the Indians, and so on, established civilizations long before Europeans. So Western Europeans are, relatively speaking, newcomers to civilization. And in concrete terms, the question posed is really this: how is it that a small, resource-starved, culturally backward, and spiritually underdeveloped section of the planet's inhabitants transform themselves into the dominant and materially rich section of the world? That is the basic thing that happened in the world, the most important development, I will put across, for the last over the last 600 years. And the question is, how did this happen? And more importantly, what have been the consequences, most of which still live in our lives today? My answer is that basically, Europeans possessed just about one technological advantage over the rest of the world, and that's military technology. And they had a propensity to use that military technology wherever they felt to impose and maintain their own dominance. There were no moral scruples towards doing anything to impose themselves on other people. And the gun has been used, and by gun I mean military technology, to conquer and dominate sections of the world and to maintain that dominance. If we look around the world today, we're going to see that same scenario being played out, with some countries attempting to arm themselves with weapons that will prevent domination, and certain other countries saying, hey, you mustn't have this. You know, only white countries, in other words, should have the nuclear bomb. You know, brown countries, and think about Africa developing a bomb. Everybody would be horrified. But the people who've committed the most mass murders and the most immoral acts for the longest time in the history of this world claim to be the moral custodians of the planet. And we're going to come back to those contradictions in a moment. So let us recognize that wherever Europeans went in their escapades out of their dark ages into other sections of the world that they claim to discover, these sections that had civilization running for thousands of years before Europeans appeared in the world, they have created mass murder, genocide, cultural genocide. That's ethnocide. And recently we've become familiar with that process under the terminology of ethnic cleansing. There's been lies, rapes, just mention just about anything, mass and ritual terrorism, other forms of immoral, ungodly, unchristian behavior that became standard practice wherever Europeans went. So in the Americas, including the Caribbean, native peoples were massacred. Thousands, millions were killed. In Africa, the same story. In Australia, the same story. In parts of Asia, the same story. And let us pause here for a moment to consider what transpired and always the living consequences for us alive in this dimension of time today. We must factor in the destruction and distortion of the world's storehouses of indigenous knowledge, information, insight, technique, and the intergenerational conversations through which all of this were continuously improved upon and transformed forward from one generation to the other. All of that was substantially destroyed, distorted, or arrested to various degrees. And Europeans imposed themselves and their cultures or culture upon other people. It is not coincidental that we meet here in this country and we're having this conversation now. The two people who suffered the most and the longest from these Western European depredations have been indigenous Americans and African people. And our experiences at the foundation of the United States of America offer us a unique vantage point from which to understand the history of this moment. In other words, why are we here? Where are we coming from? Let us focus for a moment upon the African Holocaust, or the African aspect of this Holocaust. We understand, we recognize that Native Americans are still experiencing a Holocaust, but I just want to focus in the small time available upon the African aspect of this Holocaust, and because it's us also.
Back to Nehusi, you have one minute, okay?
Okay, let me just say that wherever we have experienced, African people have experienced Europe in this way, it has been the imposition of Western European culture in an effort to make African people into the N-word as a result of that imposition of Western European culture. So all the features of Western European domination came out of that moment and that culture. So race, sex, color, and all those other contradictions that we know about have been imposed upon us in that moment of contradiction. The police brutality we experience today came out also of that moment. We were policed, as some of our colleagues have said, by forces that have become the police today, modernized, if you wish, into the police today. So the formation that we know as local police forces are still the same in terms of their purpose, their intention, although they continue to update themselves. Police brutality, therefore, is but one aspect of our experience in these places, and we must see it as that. I end with two observations. One, that we have to ask, how is it that a nation that could send millions of its citizens to fight for liberation of white people in Europe, of brown people, they say, in Korea and Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq, who could send men and women to space and men to the moon? A can-do nation has refused to do for a large section of its citizens. It's an absence of political will. It's not an absence of capacity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nehusi. Thank you very much. I appreciate it so much. Thank you kindly. I'm so pressed for time for so many people who still remain here, and I appreciate it. We're trying to keep our speakers to 5 to 10 minutes. So at this time, Dr. Ibram Kendi, Director of the Antiracist Institute at Boston University, an anti-racist proponent, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, the National Book Award winner for Stamped from the Beginning, and who has been called in the Washington Post the ascendant intellectual of his time, is a graduate of Temple University's Department of Africology. We're happy to have Dr. Kendi here today for 10 minutes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Dr. Asante, and it's truly an honor to be a part of this this conference. And I'll probably go way less than 10 minutes. But I just wanted to speak briefly about what I've been calling the racial pandemic within the viral pandemic. And by late March of this year, the COVID-19 was considered by many to be the so-called great equalizer. At the time, we did not have any racial data to even know whether indeed this coronavirus was the great equalizer. But then in early April, some of us started calling for racial demographic data on who was being infected, on who was being killed. And as soon as states started releasing, as many of you know, racial demographic data, we began to see from the beginning that Black people were disproportionately dying of COVID-19. And really since that time, Black people have been dying at nearly twice the rate of their population across the United States. And since that time, the highest death rates in the country have been in typically majority Black counties like Southwest Georgia, around Albany, Georgia, which really for 2 months has had the highest death rates, even though, and so what was fascinating was by mid-April, when this became a national story, when people began to realize that Black people were disproportionately infected and dying of COVID-19, there wasn't a new recognition that there was a pandemic emerging, thereby resources were needed, thereby attention was directed. No, what initially happened was Black people were blamed, as usual, for their own deaths. And so it was initially thought that Black people were disproportionately infected and dying because Black people were not socially distancing, because Black people were not taking the virus seriously, because Black people, there was something wrong with Black people, when indeed studies had already shown by late March that Black people were actually taking the virus more seriously than white people. And so then, as many of you know, by late April, white people started protesting to open states back up, claiming the virus was a hoax. And so no longer could they simply say that Black people were not taking the virus seriously when they were watching on their television screens, white people not taking it seriously. So then it switched to, well, Black people have more pre-existing conditions, and they have more pre-existing conditions because they don't take care of themselves. And even Black people were saying this. And if only Black people made better health choices, then they wouldn't have so many pre-existing conditions. If only they worked out more, if only they ate better, as if white people weren't gathering together to eat hot dogs and hamburgers, at their barbecues. And so then suddenly it became all about pre-existing conditions. Even the Surgeon General was urging Black and even Latinx people to stop drinking and stop smoking, as if that had anything to do with COVID-19. But we now know that all along, the problem wasn't Black people. We know all along that the problem was the conditions that Black people had been forced in due to white supremacy, due to racism. We actually know now that even more predictive than pre-existing conditions for Black infection and death rates have been access to medical insurance. So Black people are less likely than white people, far and away less likely to have health insurance. And so Black people were more likely to be showing up at hospitals with advanced stages of COVID-19, thereby more likely to die. We now know that Black people are less likely to be able to work from home. They were forced, of course, to leave their homes and work in positions as so-called essential workers, even though they were never treated as essential. We know that more predictive than pre-existing conditions have been Black people being forced to live in neighborhoods with higher levels of air and water pollution. We also know that it's also due to the fact that Black people are more likely to live in what's called trauma deserts, in which there isn't access to high-level trauma care as those Black folks are suffering in Southwest Georgia. And so we now know that America was killing Black people at the same time COVID-19 was killing Black people. And then America was then blaming COVID-19 and Black people for the deaths of Black people. When all along, America was the problem. When all along, white America was the problem, denying their role in the history of their racism towards Black people. And then what was fascinating, and what remains fascinating, and then I'm gonna sort of be quiet, is, by late April, you had white people protesting, of course, to reopen states. And then when governors realized that it was Black people who were dying, especially the governor of Georgia, suddenly they were able to reopen states. And suddenly there was no longer a pandemic. Suddenly it doesn't matter if people are out sort of infecting each other. And then you had these, again, white people saying that, you know what, I want the freedom. I want the freedom to infect people. And I wrote an essay on this, and I talked about this being like the slaveholder's mentality. In other words, I, as an individual, want the freedom to infect all of those people. Forget that the community wants freedom from me. No, I want the freedom to infect people, to enslave people, to exploit people. And in many ways, we've been fighting against a form of white supremacy that desires that individual freedom to infect, to enslave, to kill, to exploit, while Black people, while African people has been fighting for this community freedom from slavery, from exploitation, from poverty, right? And I think in many ways, this has been one of the sort of grand battles. Ever since slave traders arrived on the shores of Western Africa hundreds of years ago, imagining that they were bringing civilization when we all know what they were bringing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kendi, for that presentation, and we will look forward to hearing more from you. Our next speaker, as we move on with this webinar, is Dr. Ronaldo Anderson, who is a professor at Harris Stowe University in Missouri. He is the major Afrofuturist intellectual leader, perhaps. He's known all over the African world and Europe for his work on Afrofuturism. His book, Afrofuturism, which he co-authored, Afrofuturism 2.0, helped to shape the field of Afrofuturism. Dr. Ronaldo Anderson.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank you, Dr. Asante and the Temple faculty for inviting me to participate in this. Several years ago, during the time of the Ferguson Rebellion here, a lot of the ideas that we would later call 2.0 we used to create what we call the Black Speculative Arts Movement. That was co-founded by people like John Jennings and myself. And we started advancing these Afrofuturist ideas because we were basically dissatisfied with the neoliberalism of the Obama administration, which, truth be told, the prison industrial complex was administered just as well under him as it was under previous presidents. And so we put together this second wave of Afrofuturism and the Black Speculative Arts Movement to start providing an alternative vision to Black neoliberalism, and then focus on institutional examples of white supremacy and other potential threats to African life around the world. When I thought of today's topic of racism and anti-racism in the social contract, I had to take a look at what is a social contract. And it's basically where the members of the society to cooperate to sacrifice some benefits for the greater good. And it comes from thinkers like Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke. Black Americans have never been a part of a social contract in the United States. And the example that we have to look at that is every contract that they ever made with the Native Americans, they broke. So what Black Americans, African Americans, and people of African descent we're under what Charles Mills calls a racial contract. And Mills talks about, in contrast to the social contract, where you have a defensible moral code, the racial contract is characterized as an unjust exploitive society ruled by an oppressive government and regulated by an immoral code. Furthermore, this racial contract rests on three existential claims. White supremacy, both local and global, exists and has existed for centuries. White supremacy should be thought of as a political and economic system. And finally, white supremacy can illuminatingly be thought of as based on a contract between whites. This contract has white elite signatories with all whites as beneficiaries of what Du Bois described as the psychological wages of whiteness. That's why they're all upset about their Confederate flag and monuments and stuff being challenged at the moment. And this situation has led to a crisis in white Western civic society, where this contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, producing the same ironic outcome that whites will be unable to understand the worlds they themselves have made. And in their ignorance, that's why they can walk around in our presence with no care about their other minor ethnic citizens in the country without masks and infecting the rest of us during this pandemic. Now, the key is that what I'm thinking of is what do we want? Since the racial, I think right now, the racial contract looked like it's going to be amended, because an earlier part of the contract, I think, was the system, elite whites giving their blessing to the previous president to be elected, thinking that would help modify the racial contract. And now it appears we're being offered a Black woman as a potential vice president candidate. And they even have, and I'm always worried when I hear Forbes magazine and them talking about reparations. So I'm looking at whatever they're offering for the new amended racial contract may mean we're offered reparations and a Black vice president at the expense of Africa and the rest of the diaspora. And, or as James Baldwin once said, what is going to be the price of the ticket? Now, to this end, in this current moment, what is the Black Speculative Arts Movement doing? Two things we're doing right now. One, a few weeks ago, we started an online art exhibition, and it's called Curating the End of the World. And we came up with that title because of this intersection of this plague, the economic crash, and the threat of global white supremacy, or what I call Chimerica, because China and the United States, the white elites, are jointly partnered in exploiting people of African descent in Africa. So that's why I call it Chimerica. However, as we chronicle this pandemic and curating the end of the world right now, and we're going to be doing it in conjunction with New York Live Arts for the next year, we're going to be collecting all these ideas and art to chronicle what happens during this era of social change. And I think we believe, despite the efforts of the Black Lives Matter reform movement, that will not be enough for what we need going forward into the future. We recently published, with the aid of some Mexican brothers and sisters in Mexico on their platform, Terremoto, we put together a document. I co-authored it with Tiffany Barber. It's called The Black Angel of History. And we're looking at those ideas of the Black Angel of History and related to art and creativity, technology, Pan-Africanism and geopolitics, and the accelerating pace of change in relation to this plague. And one of the things we're arguing now, we need a contract for the Black International. We need, for example, the African Union to create a path for Africans in the fifth zone to participate in a more meaningful way, whether through dual citizenship, to participate in empowering each other, along with the African diaspora and what they usually call CARICOM, or the Caribbean Basin. And we need an international Black social contract to be formulated. And I think some of that seems to be on the horizon now, as I know that the African Union is going to be going to the United Nations on our behalf, dealing with this issue of racism. And the Caribbean is now standing up talking about reparations from the United Kingdom. But reparations will not be enough. I think Black people in the world will not be safe until the development or emergence of a Black superpower. We are the only race that does not have a nuclear power to protect the rest of its membership. I'm just saying this as a fourth generation descendant military, ex-military serviceman of the empire, that until we have a Black superpower, we cannot really safeguard a Black future. I mean, I think, and we're going to have to show the rest of the diaspora and some members of the continent the leadership and the pathway of how we achieve this. I think any kind of amendment to the current racial contract that we live under at this time is not worth the paper it's written on. However, we do see voting as a reasonable defensive strategy to at least combat some of the more ignorant forms of white supremacy. So it'll give us some more breathing space to continue to create and educate and try to survive what's going to happen during this winter and what they're calling the dark winter. I think the ignorance that we're seeing at this present moment is going to probably transition into more outright savagery, as with disruptions in food supplies, the instability within the economic system, and the geopolitical instability, because they've already forecast, even after COVID-19 is over, there are going to be waves of ultra nationalism sweeping the world. They've already made the decision in an article called Magic Money that they're going to continue to print money, even if Africa and the rest of the global South cannot print its own money. So we are going to have to cast our visions and work to look out for our brothers and sisters over on the continent and the rest of the diaspora, even if they offer us a racial contract which will tempt us to abandon them. And that is the challenge that I'm calling for to everybody that's within the sound of my voice, that the price of the ticket cannot be at the expense of the rest of the brothers and sisters in the diaspora and the continent. And I thank you for these few moments of time that you've allowed me to share my ideas. But you can see, if you check out our webpage at bsam-art.com, or our recent article, The Black Angel of History and the Age of Necro-Capitalism, you can see a further refinement of some of the thoughts that I've shared with you at this time. And I want to thank the artists of the movement like Stacey Robinson, John Jennings, Quentin Versetti, and Dr. Natasha A. Kelly. All over the world in our network now, you have Black men who are working on developing visions for a Black future for our yet unborn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rinaldo. And thank you for putting us back on time. We're about 2 minutes behind, but you did a good job of putting us right where we need to.
Well, Brother Floyd only had 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So
there you go, right. I appreciate you so much. I should point out that we're probably going to go to the attendees, and there are nearly 800. We had up to about 900. But I want you to know that we're probably going to go until 5 p.m. because we still got speakers. We were scheduled to 4, but we still have speakers, and we're probably going to go to 5. And I want to thank, in case Michelle Bonilla has to leave, she's been an incredible administrator to help us technically here. And so we now have Taharka and Belinda, I guess, will carry us through. So the next speaker is Professor M.K. Asante, and the name really sounds like my name. He is associate professor at Morgan State University in Baltimore and film. He's a filmmaker, The Black Candle, and he's the author of several books, including Buck and It Is Bigger Than Hip Hop. And he is the host and executive producer of Wild Black, a Snap original docuseries currently nominated for a Critics' Choice Award. Professor M.K. Asante, you have 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Molefi Kete Asante. It's really, I'm so honored to be on this incredible, panel conference. I'm so honored to be here virtually. I'm so honored to be amongst some of the leading, most powerful, profound intellectuals in the world. And so it's such an honor, and it's even more of an honor, I have to say this, to be your son. Because to watch you even put this together, it's really incredible. And there's such a sense of urgency, and I just love what you're doing, the example that you set for me and the youth and all your students and everyone. So I want to say publicly that it is an honor to be your son. It is an honor to be in this room, in this space. Thank you, Asante Sana. I know I don't have a whole lot of time. And so what I wanted to share in this moment is a poem called Two Sets of Notes. And I believe that it is one of the solutions and answers to the time that we find ourselves in now. When I was growing up, my father always talked to me about taking 2 sets of notes. And that was something that was stressed in the house. And I want to share a piece related to that. I find myself feeling as if I'm touching the ground and the ceiling. In schools that do not engage in healing, they simply open the wounds and entrap me in rooms where I am consumed by hypocrisy. But hold on. Even Greek philosophers weren't the authors of their own philosophies. And the statues on campus be watching me. Washington, Jefferson, Williams clocking me as if to say my time's up. But I don't run laps on tracks. No, I run laps around the scholars of tomorrow because their new schools of thought are merely our histories borrowed. And they labeled me militant and Black national radical. They tried to put my learning process on sabbatical. But I don't apologize. I spit truth into those eyes that have been infected by those lies. Then they try to get me to see their point of view from a cat that looked like me. But he don't walk like me, talk like me, or act like me. And that brother started running when I asked if he was Black like me, mastering their thoughts and forgetting our own. And you wonder why we always feel alone. From the media to academia, hanging brothers like coats. That's why in they schools, I always take 2 sets of notes. 1 set to ace the test, and the other set I call the truth. And when I find historical contradictions, I use that first set as proof that Black youth's minds are being polluted, convoluted, diluted, not culturally rooted in anything except the Western massacre. That's why in school, we were taught to be scared of Africa. We viewed our mother's land through the eyes of racists like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, not knowing Immanuel Kant tell me nothing about a land he's never seen, a land rich with history, beautiful kings and queens. But they had us believe otherwise. The history they taught was built on high-rise lies. They didn't teach me that the pyramids were completed before Greece and Rome were conceptualized. Then they tried to get me to see their point of view from a cat that looked like me, but he don't walk like me, talk like me, or act like me. And that brother started running when I asked if he was Black like me, mastering their thoughts and forgetting our own. And you wonder why we always feel alone. From the media to academia, hanging brothers like coats in they school take 2 sets of notes. One set to ace the test, the other set I call the truth. Use those first set as proof that Black youth minds are being polluted, convoluted, diluted, not culturally rooted in anything except the Western massacre. You can't be scared of Africa. You cannot view your mother's land through the eyes of racists like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, not knowing Immanuel Kant tell me nothing about a land he's never seen, a land rich with history, beautiful kings and queens. But they had us believe otherwise. History taught on high-rise lies. They didn't teach us that the pyramids were completed before Greece and Rome were conceptualized. Can it be any clearer? Black students, look in the mirror. You are a reflection of divinity. Don't let them fool you with selective memory. Walk high, listen to the elders who spoke. Black students, always take 2 sets of notes.
Hey,
Asante Sana.
hey, Asante Sana, MK Asante, thank you very much.
Thank you, I appreciate you.
Presentation. All right, go out and make the film.
And by the way, I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Abdullah, whose daughter is actually featured in our show Wild Black on Snapchat.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate you. Asante Sana, is Dr. Nilgan Anadolu Okur in the audience, in the panel? I don't see her, I didn't see her name, but she was scheduled to be here. So Dr. Zizwe Poe. Dr. Poe is a professor of history at Lincoln University, and he is the creator, the founder of the Black Studies program at Lincoln University. He's the major authority, I believe, on Kwame Nkrumah and the author of the important book, Kwame Nkrumah's Contribution to Pan-African Agency and Afrocentric Analysis. Dr. Zizwe Poe is featured around the world for his articles and is recognized as one of the key people in the whole question of African revolution. Dr. Zizwe Poe, you are now on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asante, and all of the great guests who are here. And besides the folks who are not here, who may be on the front lines trying to help get us some reparations in whatever form they're trying to do it. Let me just first correct just a little bit of information. I did not found Black Studies at Lincoln University, but I am one of the creators of the Pan-Africana Studies, which is a descendant of Black Studies. It includes Black Studies, plus tries to give some kind of a political, historical connection to power, as some of the speakers had talked about. So following the lead of Dr. Asante, who was my dissertation advisor and was a very good mentor years ago, I won't try to date him, but following his lead, and also all of these other people I know, Dr. Dove, how y'all doing, everybody, Dr. Karanga, sorry, I had to do that. I have to recognize people I haven't seen in a while, and that the fact that we're brought here on this auspicious occasion. Dr. Asante, you know I'm very disciplined. I'm gonna stick to my 8 minutes. So let me start off in the beginning. I'm trying to come up with a summary of what racism is, anti-racism, and the way forward. The bottom line for me is in 2018, I went and spoke to a group of students at the University of Nsukka in Nigeria, and they asked me what racism was. And I had them close their eyes and imagine 3 images. I said, imagine God, the devil, and some angels. And then I told them to open their eyes. I said, now you know what racism is. I didn't even have to explain it to them. They saw the white people running through their mind. And they understood at that point that if you think God and the angels are white and the devil is black, well, then all of a sudden, you know, everything else that you do, especially if you have this high regard for who you consider the creator, and you know nothing about your own traditional religions, then they're kind of caught. So in terms of what racism is a pandemic that's much older than COVID-19 that is used by business institutions, specifically the United States. And I call it really, I usually call it United States of corporations, because in reality it was started as a business and it still is a business. And if you didn't have private profit to generate, if you didn't have private property to generate private profit, then more than likely you had to be the private property for somebody else's private profit. And that's been basically a history of human relations inside of the United States of corporations. So let me say this to just go on quickly. This fight against the police, in reality, what they teach you in political science is usually a lot of noise. Because in reality, in a country like the United States, where business interest is prime, the only two real state institutions that there are when everything goes wrong is the police and the military. And so I'm overwhelmed and happy to hear somebody say defund the police because they want to redirect some of the resources in other places. But like many of our speakers in this audience, we know it's much deeper than just defunding the police. But as a Pan-Africanist for more than 40 years, every time I look at a reform that the United States is offering anybody, I'm wondering, is this reform going to help us be closer to revolution, or will it tighten the grip of slavery and neocolonialism on us? So I'm always concerned about that. So I'm for defunding the police, but I think if you're defunding the police, you have to also defund the United States military, especially Afrikan. As Dr. Asante said, my research is in Nkrumah, and when Nkrumah was alive, who was an alum from Lincoln University, when he was alive, though, as the president of Ghana, Ghana was a liberated state. And like other countries who were coming to liberation, they were saying, we want no U.S. military inside of African countries, because they knew U.S. military is just the United States police outside of America, and the police are just the United States military inside of the United States. And so they kicked out military bases almost all over Africa. But today there's over 24 Afrikan bases, and most of those bases were set up under Barack Obama. So the only question I have in this whole thing about racism, I think we need to understand that racism is organic to the United States project. So those of you who may want to struggle with racism may have to struggle with your own patriotic identity. I find that this is where we get stuck. And even in today's discussion, it was a great discussion. Some folks are clearly not trying to build the United States corporations. And some folks clearly are trying to figure out how they could possibly make it work. But I think the more that they study the history, the more that they'll come up to the common conclusion from all of us that this thing is headed north. Some people say headed south, but my orientation is toward Kemet. And I know that north is down in Kemet and south is up. So this country is headed north, and we need to be mindful that it's headed north so that a lot of us don't flow that way with it and begin to build these other institutions. I love the young brother today talk about building local self-agency, because the first step of reparations is self-repair. And then you can fight the war and win the repairs that you're owed. But only victors win reparations. So once we begin to self-repair, we've already won one victory. And that victory may be the centering of ourselves and locating what our challenges are. I think that's all I have to say, Dr. Sandy, because I think there are a lot of great people here. And like Dave Chappelle, I'm willing to ride in the back seat of this one because I love this ride. Oh, one last thing. So some of the other people on here have experienced the kind of explosion we're looking at 3 times. We experienced it from Watts to the death of King. We experienced it in the Rodney King aftermath. And since 2014, we've been experiencing. So we get elated when we feel this uprising. Matter of fact, I was really elated to see that the folks went straight for the police station. They always say they're burning their own neighborhood. But I try to repeat what KRS said, is that if it was their neighborhood, they wouldn't be getting killed in it. So I was kind of happy to see folks go straight to the police department. I was like, yeah. Because the last time I heard of somebody doing that, it was after the killing of all those Black Panthers in 68 and 69, and it was the Black Liberation Army that had a plan for going for the police stations. And Assata Shakur was one of those, one of my sheroes, Assata Shakur. I hope she gets a chance to see this. Big up, Assata. Be careful, because these folks are still doing what they were doing before. Thank you, Dr. Asante, for this opportunity and to be with all of these great scholars.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Poe. You were well trained. Appreciate it. You were right on time. All right. Okay. Okay. So there are a couple of questions that some people are asking, and I was just looking to see whether or not the questions were pointed to any particular people, and they are not pointed. They are. I don't see these being directed. There is, well, I don't know whether These are from Dr. Shockley and Dr. Karenga. Dr. Shockley, is it realistic? Is Dr. Shockley still here? Is it realistic to think that we can live in peace with our enemy here in the United States and globally? Can Blacks expect things to get better or worse? Many Blacks are in fear and don't know what's coming.
Yes. Thank you for the question. Is it realistic for us to think that we can live with our enemy? I think that you can live anywhere you want to live if you have agency, if you have independence, if you have a sense of who you are, and if you have control over the resources and control over the education system of your community. Now, if the people that you're living among won't let you do that, then the war that has been waged against you is one where you won't be able to live amongst them. Our problem right now is that we're trying to cooperate with people who are not willing to cooperate with us.
Okay, that's good, Dr. Kemet. All right, that's good. Now, the reason I'm stopping you is because you got another question, and it's a question from Namibia. Somebody in Namibia is listening, and they're saying, question for Dr. Kemet Shockley. What is an African-centered education grounded on? What's the grounds for an African-centered education? Is what this
is grounded in African culture. It means the adults become familiar with, and they're in their process of re-Africanization. And what they do is they transmit that which they have as a part of who they are to the children. The same way you can be grounded in a Eurocentric education, which means you be grounded in all the things we're currently grounded in, which are not a part of who we are, and they're foreign and alien to us, and we transmit that to children. We can do the same thing using what we really actually need, which is our own cultural ideas, motifs, and things of that nature.
Thank you. Dr. Amari Johnson. Dr. Johnson, there are models of community building that are working in the United States, but not much publicity is provided. Question, how do you work with your allies? Allies have different levels of consciousness about the struggle.
Dr. Johnson stepped away.
Dr. Johnson stepped away. Dr. Karenga, we have a question for you, and I think we should go forward after this. This question is, how can community, Dr. Karenga, how can the community stop the Black on Black killing each other and innocent children? It's out of control. What can we do to help, to be a solution?
Yes.
Yes.
The first thing we have to do is reconceive the problem. The problem is the context in which people don't have the values that they should have and relate to each other wrongly. We can't borrow the language of the dominant society, which first of all, racialized crime, calls it black on black, and then at the same time, criminalize the race. If you can convince people that there's a black crime and not a white crime, even though they waged all the world wars and killed millions of people, right? Hundreds of millions of people, then you cannot break through the conceptual imprisonment that they impose on you. The way we have to do is to wage the struggle, to start the struggle against the real problem we have, which is our oppression and our oppressor. And so what we have to do, if we spend time on that, we have less time to as Fanon said, turn our violence or our negativism on each other. We need to learn a different language. We can't present a whole conversation about what white people are doing and forget to talk about our culture. One of the most important things we can do is dialogue with our culture. And by culture, I mean the totality of thought and practice by which a people creates itself, celebrates, sustains, and develops itself, and introduces itself to history and humanity. And if we do that, ground ourselves in our own culture, speak our own special culture truth, we can reclaim our lives and begin to relate to each other as African people. But we must do it in the process of struggle, internal struggle and external struggle at the same time. In fact, we see ourselves evolving in our own history, reshaping the world in a more human and productive image, and in the interest of African people, human good, and the well-being of the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karenga. Dr. Molina Abdullah's guide for who to contact in emergent, urgent, and situations of distress need to be shared with all communities of color. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Abdullah. This is just a comment that was made to her. There are 136 questions from the audience. I'm only, there's someone who asked me, will you let Dr. Ronaldo Anderson make his presentation? You have allowed everyone else on the panel to present except him. Why? Did I do that? I thought, didn't Ronaldo present? Did I, what, Ronaldo?
Yes, he presented.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
somebody.
he did an excellent
Yeah, somebody said
Yeah,
presented.
They must, I don't know if they were the order that,
Yeah, okay, well, okay, maybe it's out of order. Okay, Dr. Ama Mazama, is she in? She here? How can we as Black people and intellectuals be on guard for other Black scholars who, in the name of Black progress and freedom, intersect ideas of other groups, self-interest, cloaked and hidden as ours? Dr. Mazama. Okay, that's not here. All right. Okay, well, let's go back to our last speaker. Is Dr. Ibram still here? Okay. All right.
He has left.
He's left. Okay, let's go back to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Professor Lazana Hotep. Professor Hotep is actually the director at the University of California, Berkeley, for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. His book, recently out, is called Minding the Obligation. Professor Lazana Hotep, welcome. And we're ready for your presentation.
Thank you, Baba Malefe, for the invitation to be a part of such an august panel of scholars, activists, warriors who I've been very fortunate to learn from over the years, as well as organize with. So it's good to connect with everyone, be a part of this conversation. As this painting by Brother Kadir Nielsen shows on the cover of one of the recent issues of the New Yorker, it shows that the murder of George Floyd is not an incident in which it is isolated from the realities of Black people sojourn here in America. And as you can see, George Floyd's body is filled with our ancestors from the transatlantic slave trade and those who went through the Ma'afa, all the way those who went through Jim Crow segregation, and then the many women, men, and children from Emmett Till all the way to Tamir Rice and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, who've been killed by this system. And so we understand that this is a broader tradition. And as has been said before, we're at war. And our great artist, athlete, scholar, and warrior, Paul Robeson, put it this way. He said, there are no impartial observers. The struggle invades the formerly clustered halls of our universities and the other seats of learning. The battlefront is everywhere. There is no sheltered rear. And we see that more now more than ever. But one of the things I want to address was along the line of Dr. King and Dr. Johnson and Brother Shockley, Dr. Shockley, who talked about education. And the educational system that we're involved in is a weaponized system. And to weaponize something is to use something in order to deliberately inflict harm on people, is to weaponize it. And so when we look at these types of outcomes where Black children at white schools are more likely to be told they have a learning disability, or we look at reports like the Get Out report done by my brothers Frank Harris, Luke Wood, and Tyrone Howard, called Get Out, looking at Black male suspensions in California public schools, and really going into the data, showing how disproportionately these students are represented as an allusion to what Dr. Abdullah had talked about earlier. And then in the state of California where I reside, you see that since 1980, in the state of California, they built 22 prisons and only one university. And so as we look at these data, we realize that the problem never has and does not reside in our communities and in our peoples, but it resides in the institutions and the structures, because an individual in a community does not have the power to build 22 prisons in one university. And I'm talking about in terms of people of African descent, the people who have been on the wrong side of this type of equation. So we have to understand that this weaponization of education has been there since the beginning. And in Self-Taught by Heather Andrea Williams, she talks about this whole notion of how we are able to have, and it's been mentioned of the Enlightenment period due to the notion of the social contract, how we've been able to have this racialized system that we have. And I'm talking specifically about the role education has played in it. So in her book, she says, masters made every attempt to control their captives' thoughts and imaginations, indeed their hearts and minds. Maintaining a system of bondage in the age of enlightenment depended upon the masters being able to speak for the slave, to deny his or her humanity, and to draw a line between slave consciousness and human will. Literacy among enslaved Africans would expose slavery, and they knew it. Going to Raising Races by Christina Durocher, she talks about the textbooks and the literature in the Jim Crow South. And she says, in their perpetuation of the myth of African American inferiority, the textbooks and literature white Southerners created for school children reveal how completely white supremacy was embedded in Southern white culture. And then moving forward with Dr. William Watkins and his great work, The White Architects of Black Education, he says, I have come to understand what people in power have long known. Education can be used to both oppress and to liberate. Ideas are indeed powerful things. I further come to understand that America's colonization of blacks employed the textbook as often as the bullet. Colonial education in America was designed to control, pacify, and socially subject people. The education of Black Americans has always been inextricably connected to state politics and the labor market. So here we can see through the scholarship and the literature, the chronicling and the documentation of the weaponization of the educational tools. But a lot of people who find themselves in education, whether that's P-12, community college, university, or even trade schools, are timid and have a reluctancy to engage in this issue of the racialization of education. And then they come to folks like us and they say, well, why are you bringing race into education, right? Race is the great equalizer. I mean, education is the great equalizer. Education is the space where we all can learn more about each other. Education is the space that is providing the level playing field. And why would you all want to bring race into this space? Not really understanding that race in education was not brought in by those of us who do this great work of working for the liberation of African people. You got to understand that if you look for the actual essence in Western American education, and you look at the foundations of it, you'll see that it was founded on this notion of eugenics and this notion of a hierarchy of races, and there being a purer race, which they labeled as the Caucasian or Aryan race, and then a spectrum of races that go down to the bottom that ends with the African and or the Negroid race. And so when you even look at the basic foundations of how we even measure intelligence in the West, Lewis Terman, who created the Stanford-Binet IQ test, which is the exam that the major assessment that people use to even measure intelligence, was known for being a staunch believer in eugenics. And so the foundational tools, the instruments themselves that they use to measure intelligence, are founded by racist. Then you have the father of the standardized testing of the SAT, was interested in mental testing while he was at Princeton. Now Terman was at Stanford. Brigham's at Princeton. So these aren't people in pickup trucks with rifle racks in the back. These are people at the most prestigious universities on the globe, and they were enthusiastic members of the eugenicist movement. And so when you see students post things like this, colleges be like, we are against institutionalized racism. Baby, you are the institutionalized racism. This particular tweet has a lot of merit, understanding from which we came and where we are. But our people have not always sat back and been victims of this system. We have always engaged this system. We have always fought this system. And in many ways, we fought this system, especially during enslavement and right after the Civil War. It says freed people, not northern whites, initiated the educational movement in the South while the Civil War was being fought. And then we have Dr. Molefi Asante's great book, The Revolutionary Pedagogy, Primer for Teachers for Black Children, talks about the notion of Afrocentricity and how we've gone throughout the country. Dr. Molefi Asante, Baba Asa Hilliard, and so many others, and implemented African-centered curriculums within the public school and the charter school systems. But to Dr. Johnson's point, one of the greatest hallmarks, and to also Kim Shaki's point, was when we began to create our independent institutions, as represented by those that were members of the Council of Independent Black Institutions, starting with the East in Brooklyn, New York, and then proliferating throughout the United States of America and even in some international formations. And so we have a responsibility to take back this weapon that has been used against us, recalibrate it, and then take this weapon and be able to arm our students and arm our communities and arm the international Pan-Africanist world with an education that's going to stop using these standards of intelligence, stop using these standards of measuring what it means to be human by people who have dehumanized us, and to get involved into this re-Africanization process and challenging the anti-Blackness. So I leave you with this quote from Dr. Tyrone Howard. Individual acts must transform into collective action, and educators can be part of that change. Schools are not immune from the perpetuation of anti-Black racism. Many students, parents, and teachers have long argued that schools are rampant with acts of anti-Black racism. Schools can be and should be better, and they must be part of the solution in a racial reckoning and healing. If deliberate steps are not taken to end anti-Black racism, it will continue to cause irreparable harm to Black students. It will also leave an indelible print on the minds and psyches of non-Black students. With that, I thank you for your time and your attention, and I am honored to be a part of this great panel, and hopefully my participation in this panel has been able to add to what has already been shared today.
Thank you very much, Professor Hotep. We're moving right on with Dr. Patricia Reed Merritt, who is a university professor. And I hope I get this right. I got some things wrong earlier, but I think the founder of the Africana Studies program at Stockton University, one of the most prominent scholars on race and racism, and whose 2-volume work, if you haven't seen it, your library doesn't have it, you should have them to get it. It's called A State-by-State History of Race and Racism in America. It is, from what I've seen, the most comprehensive state-by-state record of racial abuse that I've seen. And she's also the author of many other books, including Race in America, How a Pseudo-Scientific Concept Shaped Human Interaction. My good friend, Dr. Patricia Reed Merritt, you got 10 minutes.
Okay, am I on?
You're on.
All right, Hotep.
Hotep.
Good to see you, Dr. Asante. Thank you for inviting me. Good to see my other friends, Dr. Malana Karinga. Wonderful to hear you. And I'm thankful for everybody who made contributions today. So much has been said. It's not a whole lot we don't understand. I just want to do a couple of things. One is I want to talk about what is it when we say race? How do we understand race? And those of us in America, and certainly those of you in this forum, have a good understanding of what race is in America. And basically, race has been socially constructed to be based on the color of one's skin. We have Black people, we have brown people, we have white people. Race, that's what race is here. And when people say, as they often do, well, there's only one race, it's the human race. Certainly there's a human race, but the human race is not monolithic. There's variations in the human race. And what people have been able to do, those who have been our oppressors, has been able to take various groups and assign value to them. And as so many people on the panel have already said, white people are assigned to the highest level of value in society. And white supremacy has resulted in people of color being oppressed and oppressed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Racism, as we know it, is a variation of understanding race and the value of race. And when we talk about racism, we're talking about the belief in white superiority. Not just the belief in white superiority, but that it's inherent, just like Black inferiority would be inherent. And so we have this notion of racism that has gotten into the American system, and we have institutional racism, which is my far greatest concern. How you deal with institutional racism? How do we gain? How do we make structural changes? When we talk about institutional racism, we have to understand that racism in America, and this does not mean that racism is not a global phenomenon, because indeed it is. But when we talk about racism in America, we're talking about a value that is as American as apple pie and baseball. It's embedded in the American culture from the very beginning. It's in the fabric of the culture. It gets into every institution that we know that attempts to organize the American culture. Whether we're talking about education, criminal justice, hospitalizations, mental health, the family, relationships. Racism is a part of that. And that's something that we all need to understand, because when we talk about the things we need to do right now, and I think this is what this is truly about. People have made wonderful comments about where we have been, where we're going, wonderful. But we need to talk about this moment. It's this moment that has brought us all here. And what we need to understand about this moment is that we have opportunity for change, for more change, but it's not disconnected from previous moments. It is not disconnected from the liberation struggle that has been going on for 400, 500 years. It is not something that emerged as a result of our recent crisis. It's just what the current generation is going to do to advance the struggle for liberation for Black people. And as you know, Fanon always reminds us that every generation has to decide what their contribution is going to be to the advancement of the struggle, to the advancement of Black freedom. And that's the challenge for this generation. And so there are many things that we can look at that's happening today that certainly do give us hope. But we have to connect them with all the struggles that went before, the struggles that we engaged in the past, how we advanced, where we were successful, and where we made some errors. When I think about where we are today, and when I think about limiting my comments to 8 to 10 minutes, I think of AE. That's what I tell myself. And what does that mean? A means we have to start from a place where we acknowledge that something was wrong, something has gone wrong. We need acknowledgement. You can't have people acting like, as so many people have said, I didn't know all this was going on. Okay, we don't know why you weren't woke, but you woke now. And so we're talking about acknowledging where we are. We're also talking about an awareness. We need an awareness. We can't have people acting as if they have no memory of what happened in the past, that they had no exposure to race and racism. And so you have to be part of that. You do have to have the E, as I say, AE. Education, not education to oppress, but education to liberate. And we have to have education. We have to be able to go back and re-educate ourselves. Many of us have fine degrees from universities, institutions of higher education, state universities, Ivy League institutions, etc. But as my mentor, Dr. Thad Mathis, always told me, you went there to get your training. Education occurs in the Black community. You have to find your education based on knowledge that's a reflection of who we are, where we've been. So many of you have made contributions to that. And when we talk about what we need to do beyond education is where we are with the second A in AE. We have to engage in action, advocacy. This is what makes this moment so important right now. And as Brother Poe said earlier, yeah, I'm with David Chappelle too. We can sit in the back and not ride this one out, but certainly let this current generation make their contribution to the struggle. Make their contribution in understanding that we have been at this place before, we are here again today, and we're going to advance the movement for freedom and liberation one more step ahead. And so when we say action and advocacy, yes, people are in the street. More of you should go to the street. Not necessarily those of us who senior citizens have other issues, but yes, go to the street. People used to say for a period of time, oh, when you talk about that marching, that's the stuff that happened in the 60s and the 70s. No, that's the stuff that's happening now. And if you can get out there and be a marcher, you should be. But you have to do other things. I think it's the brother Dr. Hotep just said. We cannot limit this to one institution. We can't limit this to our concerns and our cries for defunding the police department. We have to look at every institution that impacts our lives and ask ourselves, what can we do right now to demand change? What can we do right now to force people to acknowledge that there's something wrong within these systems, that institutional racism is embedded in these systems, and that we need to do something to make sure that tomorrow will not be like today, and it will not be like the day before. And when I say AE, engagement, we have to maintain this engagement for a period of time. This is not something, this is the moment that we're going to take advantage of right now. But we have to use all of our energy to sustain this moment for as long as we can. We have to remain engaged for as long as we can. We still have to go to the school board meetings. We still have to go to the council meetings. We still have to go to our universities and make demands on them. At Stockton University, we're in a heated discussion now about changing the name of the institution, a discussion that we've had for more than 20 years. But now might be the moment where we achieve that. And we're going to achieve it because enough of us are going to remain engaged from here until the time that we're able to remove the name of Richard Stockton off of that university. And so we have to do these kinds of things because it's important. And so it is also important, and I've heard a number of people comment, is that, we got to look at the moral character of European people, of white people. We got to change the way in which they view Black people. We got to fight, help them understand that they're racist and all. I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about building the Black community. It reminds me of Karinga's work when he talked about the radical Black psychologist. And I remember Dr. Naeem saying, our job as Black psychologists is not to heal the psyche of white folks. We're here to deal with what the needs of Black folks are. And right now we need to deal with not just what the needs of Black folks are, but how Black folks are impacted and oppressed in our institutional systems. And so I'm about institutional change. I'm about structural change. I'm about remembering that this moment is important. It's potentially transformative, but we have to seize the moment. As you sports people would say, we have to have a full court press, and we have to do everything we can do right now to advance the freedom for Black people. And so when we talk about freedom and liberation, I'm fond of saying our struggle begins in the realm of the spirit, and it extends itself to fight for our freedom and liberation in every aspect of our lives. If you ask me, what do I want? What is the social contract between America and Black people? It is to allow us, and we will demand that we're able to live, to maximize our human potential to its fullest. Asani Sani.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Reed Merritt. Okay, we're coming now to our next presenter, who is Dr. Sonia Peterson-Lewis, who is an associate professor at Temple University, studies racism and communities, and particularly I've engaged her in questions of the inequality in small towns. She's from North Florida and I'm from South Georgia. And we often talk about racism, particularly around industry, chemistry, chemicals, and so on in these small towns. Her latest work is called Designing Questionnaires on Emotionally Charged Social Issues. Dr. Sonia Peterson-Lewis.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sante, for inviting me to this webinar. Some former students have been helping me set up technology for the fall, and suddenly a hard drive glitch has blocked my images. I had a nice little picture of myself that they took, and I don't know whether that hard drive problem reflects my students getting revenge on me or the fact that I was able to retrieve a picture of a quilt from my family.
Yeah.
Maybe the ancestors saying, stop focusing on a picture of myself and think about them. So I will get on with it. Following the trend that several other speakers have mentioned, the ideas I will share focus on the importance of minding and mining our language in negotiating the social contract. Since the 1990s, Temple University has required all of its students to take a course that focuses on race, what it is, why it is, and how it functions in society, and to affect people's lives. This past fall, to help give my students in a race class some background, and to give myself some background for a short 5-page article we were reading on the construction of race and racial inequality in colonial America, I read a book that has affected the way I think about everything. I don't trust any thought I had before I read this book. The book is In the Matter of Color, Race and the American Legal Process, and it focused specifically on the colonial period. It's by Leon Higginbotham, who's a former judge, but also a law professor. It details every law that was ever written during the colonial United States of America to construct and codify racial inequality, and ultimately racial inequality into our system. One by one, he goes chronologically through the laws that created what we see today. And I was going to read some of those laws, but in the interest of time, I will just say that those laws mandated who could own property, who could grow a garden, who could learn to read, who could testify in court, who could be called upon, who could defend themselves even against other people, and thus who was allowed to kill whom, maim whom, who was allowed to cut off ears, who was allowed to cut off feet with impunity. And those laws granted power to define who was of value, who was of worth, and power corrupts the corruptible. The people on the receiving end of this brutality were usually people of color, Africans in the main, but also Native Americans. And punishments were doled out also to any European who resisted descending into the barbarism that these laws allowed. Joyce King earlier mentioned that the Irish and the hostile stereotypes toward them, all abuses and all abusers have something in common. Prior to their immigration to the colonies, many Irish signed a petition, a compact, that they were not going to be part of the dehumanization of Africans because they had felt that sense of identification with Africans because of what they had gone through at the hands of the British. They were forced to work without compensation. Their lands were taken away for grazing livestock, so they couldn't grow food, which ultimately ended up leading many to have to leave to come to America, which also then impacts Native Americans and everything else after that. But they felt the brotherhood with Africans. But once they got to America, the divide and conquer strategy that is necessary to racialize inequality would soon force the Irish to make a choice between conforming to the demands that the law made for being protected under the label of whiteness to doing what they thought were the right things to do. So and all of this comes to a head in what's called the draft riots in 1863, what we call the Irish draft riots. I'm going to skip over some of the laws that Higginbotham mentioned, and I'm going to go, he covers at least 100 laws, everything from birthright to death rights, and everything in between. I was going to read several, but in the interest of time, I will read one law passed in 1680 that has implications for the 4 points I want to make today about the importance of how we speak about things. There was a law passed in 1680 that says, whereas the frequent meeting of considerable numbers of Negro slaves under the pretense of feasts and burials is judged a dangerous consequence, it is enacted that no Negro or slave may carry arms such as any club, staff, gun, sword, or other weapon, nor may he go from his owner's plantation without a certificate. And if he goes, then it should be only for necessary occasions. The punishment, 20 lashes on his bare back, well laid on. And further, if any Negro lift up his hand against any Christian, meaning essentially any European, if any Negro lift up his hand against any Christian, he shall receive 30 lashes. And if he absent himself or lie out of his master's service, in other words, miss work, or resist lawful apprehension, resist being captured, he may be killed, and this law shall be published every 6 months. No regard about the consequences to the person's family or any of that. So as Higginbotham discusses, this law takes away mobility, the right to travel. It takes away the right to resist or prevent those who are moving toward enslaving you. It also takes away the right to self-defense from those who attack you. And because it is a law, any violation of it makes one a criminal. And we often hear, when we look at the cases of police brutality, we often hear, well, what was the person doing? Was he obeying the law? Was he keeping to the letter of the law? We need to look at laws to realize that many of those laws were actually constructed to take away people's rights to make mobility, to move forward in the world. So I practice freedom of speech in my class because policing language makes people doubt what they have to say. It makes people nervous about speaking. But I ask students to think about, say what you want, but when you write an essay for class, think about how you use language. Do not use the laws of language to dehumanize or to take away from the rights that you as an individual want to have and that you think should be shared with others. So redefining the social contract requires that we acknowledge that it was not happenstance, but laws that created the inequalities that we now have an opportunity to change. And as Professor Reed Merritt said before me, if we are not going to have those same issues tomorrow, we have to start thinking how we think about things. So 4 concepts I've chosen to speak about here are these. The concept of society being exposed to racial inequality versus the concept of society's racial inequality being exposed. If you listen to newscasts and read news articles carefully, many proclaim that the disproportionate deaths of Blacks and other people of color and poor people due to COVID and the vigilante and police brutality death of Blacks, that those expose the society to racial inequality. There's a difference between having society exposed to racial inequality and having the society's racial inequalities exposed. The language that we have been exposed to it as if we didn't know pretends that we didn't know that there was a racial divide in terms of the type of work people do, that there are frontline workers who are more disposed as opposed to those who can work behind the scenes. It pretends we didn't know the number of jobs that some groups are having to work, not one full-time job, but 2 or 3 part-time jobs that gives them disproportionate exposure, and that they're having to take public transportation to do that. That we didn't know about the multi-generational housing conditions that are disproportionate in some communities because of lack of affordable housing, and that some grandparents, particularly where I come from, are raising their children. So when those children go out into the world and come back, they are exposing, the structure of housing is set up so that some people cannot practice social distancing. I will skip some other things I say here, but a second issue is distinguishing between a loss and a theft. If you listen carefully to media, you will hear people say it is a terrible thing that Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the list goes on, lost their lives. Did they lose their lives or were their lives stolen? Word choice is important here because most societies have a different protocol for how they deal with a loss versus how they deal with a theft. A loss is the fault of the owner. So we focus our attention on the owner. Perhaps the owner needed to be more diligent, or they wouldn't have lost what they lost. They needed to be more careful, less careless, more attentive. What was he doing there? A theft, on the other hand, is the fault of the thief. So we then have to focus our attention, put our lens, our analytic lens on the thief, and ask about the thief the same questions we were so willing to ask about the victim of the theft. Why was he or she not more diligent, more careful, less careless, more attentive? Why did he or she steal this life? So turning the gaze on the actor. Words matter. Our article also focuses on the fact that the article that I'm writing with a student on this focuses on the fact that Derek Chauvin chose to kneel. Before his kneeling, kneeling was an iconic gesture associated with athletes engaging in social protest against the police. From a psychological perspective, what does it mean that Chauvin chose this gesture to kill a man? Was it coincidence or by design that he chose to hijack this gesture that had been used to decry brutality to now forever associate it with brutality? Third, and I have one more point after this, qualifying versus dequalifying people for humane treatment. The way we speak can qualify or dequalify people for humane treatment. In many stories about the killing of Black people at the hands of the police, we hear that the person was unarmed. I understand that people use this language to make the point that the person didn't pose an equal threat to the police. However, Giffords Law Center to Prevent Law Violence, if you look at it online, it says that only 5 states prohibit carrying a weapon. Those states are California, Florida, Illinois, New York, South Carolina, the District of Columbia. 31 states allow people to openly carry a handgun with a permit, and there are without a permit, and there are 15 others that say you can carry it, but you must have a permit. If people are allowed to carry firearms, what is the calculus, the method of reasoning that we must always emphasize that the Black person who was killed was unarmed? The final point I'll mention here is, and Dr. Johnson also mentioned this, a person changing the world versus an event changing the world. We often hear that George Floyd changed the world. Dr. Johnson spoke of the danger of seeing the murder and brutalization of Black people as the icon for social change. What happened to George Floyd changed the way the world looks at things. But I would argue that it was the bravery and presence of mind of 17-year-old Darnella Frazier. She had the presence of mind and the strength of conscience to film that horrific incident and then to put it on that horrific, it wasn't an incident, that horrific situation, and then to post it on social media. She opened us to a new potential. Many people have filmed brutality, but they struggle with whether to make it known. It is the same dilemma that many law enforcement people face of weighing the comparative cost of intervening when they see injustice versus risking becoming the target of injustice themselves. Darnella Frazier changed the world. She gave us the potential. Now what we do with it tells us who we are and what we are about. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sonia Peterson-Lewis. This is, again, coming from the Department of Africology. Now we're going to go on to Dr. Valerie Harrison. Dr. Valerie Harrison is actually the senior advisor to the president of Temple University for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She holds a JD as well as a PhD in Africana Studies and Africology. And she's the co-author of the book, Do Right by Me, Learning to Raise Black Children in White Spaces. Dr. Valerie Harrison, you're on.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you, Dr. Asante, for convening this critical discussion. In the time that I've been allotted, I'd like to talk briefly about reclaiming positive racial identity and rebuilding cultural esteem as part of Black resistance. We are witnessing extraordinary resistance to police brutality and a move to change racist policies and practices. Racist policing is just one symptom of the underlying problem of white supremacy. Inferior schools and substandard housing, lack of employment opportunities, inadequate health care, and others stand side by side. And just as the symptoms are many, so are the solutions. There is an opportunity now for a corresponding movement to resist a colonized mind and instead to reclaim racial identity, rebuild cultural esteem among a broader group of Black people with a particular focus on our children. If we don't actively and intentionally work on constructing a positive Black self-identity for our children, the culture will, and in many cases already has constructed a negative one for them. And the damage is in countless ways. First, the brain science tells us that pain from social exclusion and pain from physical injury or illness share the same brain pathways that register distress. So whether we've been punched in the face or excluded from an opportunity because of a racist practice, our brain activates pain. So the bottom line is that images, messages, and actions, whether they're direct or indirect, that signal that we're left out, we're not worthy, we're lesser than, it causes real hurt to our body. And so the experiences of marginalization and exclusion register pain in the brain, and we experience it everywhere in our bodies. Second, the simple truth is that the health and well-being of Black children depend on the extent to which they feel positively about being Black. And so a poor sense of oneself as a Black person results in low self-esteem and hinders academic and personal achievement. Conversely, the research tells us that Black children thrive when they're raised to have positive racial identity. So the development of positive Black identity continues to be undermined by negative cultural constructions of Black life, and the contemporary media plays a significant role in perpetuating these negative and distorted images. Research tells us that news reports exaggerate negative portrayals of Black people, overrepresenting them in stories about poverty and crime and underrepresenting them in their roles as parent or leader. And in every age and socioeconomic group, African Americans tend to watch more television than their counterparts. And so this creates a greater risk for racial identity formation from intentionally distorted stories or stereotypes or other negative images of ourselves. And so the more that we ingest negative images of ourselves, the lower our self and cultural esteem. Also, Black children are more easily lured into mimicking unhealthy behavior when they're told that the behavior represents them. And the science backs this up as well. So when Black children see negative images of themselves, there's a real and substantial risk that they'll copy the behavior. And the negative impact of that distortion is magnified if there are no or few real life experiences with Black people that counter the images. But the promising news is that there are as many effective strategies to developing positive racial identity as there are threats to it. So first is correcting the baseline belief in the idea that Africa is somehow negative and inferior to the rest of the world. Black children must be taught that despite every human effort to destroy their potential and to deny their humanity, Black people around the world are essential contributors to the world's civilization and history. So it's the difference between telling a Black child that they started this life as an enslaved captive picking tobacco on a Virginia plantation or as a king or queen who built the first pyramids. And second, we must help them to see that white people's worldview, their culture, their history, their value system is just one among many and is not entitled to supersede the variety of perspectives in which people might proudly center themselves. Third, we can point out the negative and distorted images of Black people for what they are, tools of oppression. So if you portray Black people in as many outlets as possible as savage or dangerous or engaged in buffoonery, it is often used to justify savagery and violence, or to simply dismiss us as not worthy of value or respect. And so we could shield Black children from these negative images while saturating them with positive counter images. This has been found to be effective in building positive Black identity and self-esteem while reducing the negative impact of racism on their identity development. So this includes fostering an appreciation for, as Dr. Karenga says, the best of African and African American culture, which is certainly represented in music, dance, art, literature, rituals like Kwanzaa, and importantly, in a value system. And so in the United States, the white or European way of being is considered by many Americans, including Black Americans, as the standard. And they have little or no knowledge that another perspective or African worldview exists. So I'd just like to share one of those African cultural values that can be intentionally taught to and encouraged in our children. And that is the principle of Nzuri, that good equals beautiful. And so some theories of aesthetics deal only with physical beauty, but in the African tradition, notions of beauty are grounded in quality, and it's difficult to discuss beauty in terms of physicality. And so what is good is beautiful, and what is beautiful is good. And there's no separation of the two. Nothing is beautiful in and of itself, but because it does good. Similarly, to be a good person, you must do good things. And on the issue of justice and oppression, if the oppressed are liberated, everyone is liberated, because the oppressor no longer lives to control the oppressed, but can live freely, thereby increasing and becoming more honorable. So by changing the narrative of African inferiority and incorporating those things that we know contribute to positive racial identity, Black people need not be hindered by the physical pain and psychological distress of low self and cultural esteem, nor be discouraged under the weight of self-hatred. Rather, they can be motivated in a positive direction because they never, ever have to feel that they are a smeared carbon copy or a failed attempt at being white. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valerie Harrison. And we have, if you please stay with us, we have three speakers coming up, and then we may have a few minutes for questions, but we just have three final presentations. And if you could hang with us, it would be great for you as well as for the speakers. We're going to go to Ms. Toyo Abadari, who is a graduate student in Africology at Temple. She came to us from Stockton University, and we're going to have her to give us a 5 or 6 minutes conversation. Toyo.
Thank you, Dr. Asante, and greetings to everyone virtually attending this much needed conference. It is such an honor to be able to speak among such a distinguished group of intellectuals, some who taught me not so long ago at Stockton University, and some who are actually still teaching me now at Temple University. So shout out to all my professors. And I also just want to thank my peers, family, and loved ones, but for mostly the creator and my ancestors, for without them, I wouldn't be here today. In the spirit of Ngia, as Dr. Asante describes as the collective expression of the Afrocentric worldview, that being victorious thought and consciousness, I want us all to quickly reflect on where our focus and attention has been these past few months. Many have been consumed with staying in the know. They are either primarily focused on receiving the most recent updates in the news to be the first to speak about it, or they are spending an immense amount of time focused on what others are doing and not doing, keeping tabs on the latest performative acts by corporations and the most recent public statements by celebrities. But are we giving enough attention to the work that needs to be done to assert African agency? Are we holding establishments accountable for their continued racism and discrimination? Are we taking time to incorporate our specific and unique skills with the fight against racial injustice? Or have we been too distracted? With a background in communications, I know firsthand how deceptive the media can be in averting our focus away from attentions that actually need our attention. We have to be careful to balance our focus in a way that does not sacrifice from the work that we as Black and therefore African people need done on our terms from our perspective. So today I want to speak about resistance in the form of victorious concentration and honing into our unique and specific roles. It requires a great deal of strength and mental agility to be able to sift through the noise around us, process our emotions, grieve accordingly to the consecutive and habitual lynchings of our fallen brothers and sisters, all while continuing to live our daily lives and fight and do the work necessary to see our full liberation. It's not easy, but in order for things to be done effectively, we need to make sure we are giving enough attention to the work needed and not allowing distractions to interfere. This fight through victorious concentration requires education, organization, and clarity in our unique role. We speak often about education and organization, but I want to speak a little bit more in depth about honing into our unique roles. We have the media constantly limiting the bandwidth of what our role in this fight can entail. You can either be in the streets protesting, posting anti-racist content on social media, buying from Black companies, or making some huge display of diversity and inclusion, and that's about it. While these are great, there are more intricate roles one can play in this fight. I came across a diagram by Creative Commons that actually broke down the different roles into 10 segments. While I read them, see if any of these roles resonate with you. First, we have the weavers. They see through lines of connectivity between people, places, organizations, and ideas. The experimenters innovate, pioneer, and invent. The frontline responders address community crisis by organizing and resourcing and networking. The visionaries imagine and generate our boldest possibilities and remind us of our direction. The builders develop, organize, and implement ideas in service of a collective vision. The caregivers nurture and nourish people by creating a sustaining a community of care, joy, and connection. The disruptors take uncomfortable and risky actions to shake up the status quo and raise awareness. The healers tend to the generational and current traumas caused by oppressive systems, institutions, policies, and practices. The storytellers craft and share our community stories and experiences through art, music, media, and movement. And lastly, the guiders. They teach, counsel, and advise using their gifts of well-earned discernment and wisdom. Now, all of these roles would be pointless if we do not share the same objective. If our focus is not centered in the will of African people, if it's not centered in creating for our own, defining for our own, speaking for our own, if our work does not seek to reconstruct our lives on an Afrocentric basis, then we are only fooling ourselves. During these perilous times, it is imperative that we not get distracted and that we utilize victorious concentration and honing into our unique roles in order to end white supremacy and racism. In closing, I challenge you to consider how you are applying your time, energy, and gifts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Toyo, for that presentation. And now we will turn to Mr. Tariq Richardson, who came to us from the University of Oregon. He's a Temple University graduate student in Africology. Tariq.
Hotep, Dr. Asante. Let me unmute my screen. All right, it's so good to see all of you here. And it's also such an honor to be in the company of the greatest minds, thinkers, activists from our community in this day and age. And we also have a few legends that, names that you only see in books. So I'm very honored to be here. I'd just like to take a moment to reiterate a point which Dr. Raymond Anderson made about the topic of a social contract. So a social contract, in particular, the idea of a contract, kind of revolves around this idea of consent, right? It's an agreement between two different parties. Us as African people and how we came to this country, we never signed any form of agreement. We didn't sign any paperwork to get on an airplane or a boat or anything like that. So really, there is no social contract between us in the United States. And everything that we've ever fought and won for in this country was never given to us. Even the idea of citizenship was something that wasn't realized until 200 years after this country became a nation in its own right, and 400 years after our first people got here, did we actually start to see citizenship in the way of rights and privileges. So I think even today, we see voter suppression, we see gerrymandering, redlining, we see racist housing policies, we see food deserts in our neighborhoods. All these issues we can address, and police brutality is just one of the many issues, is really a reaffirmation of our position in this society as not full citizens, but second-class citizens that live in an apartheid state. And one of the issues, Dr. Valerie Harrison brought up, there's many issues that we have, and there's many solutions, but one of the main issues that I see that we are facing as a community is the idea of Americanism and how we view ourselves in relation to this country. So I think a lot of us have taken the bait of American nationalism and have bought into the idea of the American dream. This idea that if you work hard, if you do everything that's prescribed by the nation, you should be fine, right? And we know time and time again, this isn't the case for most of our people, right? We have a few examples. Some of us have made our way through it. And I think most of us who are on this panel as part of this webinar, we are examples of people who have been able to break the mold. And we have been able to be the exceptions. We are not a typical representation of our community. So, and then what we see, as Dr. Peterson Lewin said, the American dream, if you do everything that you're supposed to do, you'd be fine. And we see this rhetoric used over and over and over again with all of these lynchings. Oh, if they would have not done, ran away, or if they would have complied, or if they wouldn't have been in this neighborhood, or if they were to dress like this, they would be fine. So this all goes into the idea of us buying into what is prescribed by America. We don't control the narrative. We are just part of it. So when we fight for reform, we're really fighting for reform, inclusion, and really validation. We're not trying to change the system. We're just trying to be part of the system, and we want the system to be less less dangerous, less villainous towards our community. So just like this imaginary contract, we never really had a mutual understanding with white America or with other communities with what America is and how it relates to us. And I see what's going on today as a necessary fight. You know, people are fighting for reform because we live here, and obviously we want to live somewhere that we can, not be under attack constantly. But I wonder why the discussion hasn't been brought up that this isn't the only solution. We shouldn't only be fighting for reform in America, and we shouldn't only be investing. When I say investing, I'm talking about time, energy, money and our consciousness towards the idea of reforming America, when really we have a whole continent and we have many different countries around the world that are black countries that intrinsically don't want to kill us, right? So one of the solutions I see is investing in ourselves and building bridges transcontinentally with other black people. And I think part of the reason why this isn't part of a larger frame of discussion is because we've bought in so much to an American perspective of who we are and an American perspective of other black people elsewhere. Because I've talked to many people, even people in my own family, and they'll say, "Oh, I don't want to go to Africa because you know what they say, it's dirty. Wait, they've never been there." Or I have a friend who's from East Africa, and she said, "Oh, I want to go back to East Africa. That's the land where my family's from." And they said, "Oh, well, you don't know the language." So they make these invisible barriers for us. But then when we talk about America, we say, "Oh, well, I want to do this," and then we still have these same invisible barriers. Well, you know, you don't come from this neighborhood, so you're not going to be recognized for these scholarships and whatnot. Um, and one thing that I always kind of fall back onto is that it's easier.
You have 1 minute, Tariq.
1 minute? All right. It's easier for us to reform a society or to make progress when we're not fighting just for representation, but we're fighting for recognition as human beings. We're fighting for our recognition of being able to exist. Um, and I also wanted to show how ludicrous it is to me that people, when they talk about African sovereignty or they talk about creating a sovereign black community, it's always in line with the West. They say, "Oh, we want the Republic of New Africa, so we want Florida, Georgia, and Mississippi." But if we don't break away from this idea of Americanism, we are ultimately intellectually inheriting the colonial legacy of this white nationalist nation. As you know, America was created as a white nationalist project when people left Europe to spread, their ideas of life, liberty, and property. So ultimately, on ending, I just want to say I appreciate everything that everyone has said, and I urge us to invest in our communities here and invest in our brothers and sisters abroad, and most importantly, invest in yourself by educating yourself on different issues, on your history, and on theory, and understand how theory applies to all these other issues.
Thank you very much, Tariq. We appreciate that. I didn't announce that Tariq is also the editor of the Imhotep journal at Temple. Our last presenter is Taharka Ade, who has actually been co-hosting with me and been working with me today on this project. He is a PhD candidate in Africology, and he came to Temple University from Alabama State and was also the research assistant for my third edition of the History of Africa. Taharka.
Hotep, thank you for having me. I, like my colleagues before me, are very honored to be on this panel, and especially with such the prestige that is here with us today. I think first I would like to, let me say that I'm not going to be long, especially being the last speaker. I know a lot of us want to have time to reflect and maybe some questions, I'm not sure. But I want to kind of harken back on the thoughts of Dr. Reed Merritt when she said she's more interested in building black communities juxtaposed to trying to show our humanity to other people. Dr. Amari Johnson said earlier that our well-being is tied, however, to the decisions of others. And so my thoughts there become, after 400 years of fighting, why are we still begging for our lives? And much of what I'm going to say is really kind of reestablishing or really kind of summing up a lot of what some other people have said, but I think I want to sum it up a little bit more succinctly. And I think the question, and particularly in this case, is do we want, or will we continue to lean on those who are demonstratively apathetic, or even those who perform outrage but harbor enough long-term apathy that they too are ineffective? Or do we want the power to stop police from brutalizing and murdering us? And power is, of course, in many forms, political, economic, things of this nature. Corporations today, a lot of us are celebrating people like Target and Nike coming out saying Black Lives Matter, but we have to realize that this is also another form of exploitation. This is another form of also psychological warfare, because you're influenced to maybe purchase more of their products, and you think that they're this great these great companies and corporations of change, but are they really? What really have they done that, or are they planning to do that would really assist in our restoration? So, I mean, the upper stratosphere of social and economic American elitism has done everything. They've painted streets. They've promised certain small amounts of money, while they've made over $500 billion since the coronavirus incident has occurred. But but there's nothing that's really concrete, or nothing that we've really asked for. And it's because they wish to placate us, and we remain to be, in many ways, passive participants in the system of gross capitalism, racism, and imperialism, suffering peacefully under regimes of oligarchs. And the question becomes, is our agency so one-dimensional and limited as that in which we remain those who beg powers to do right by us, instead of being powerful in our own right, to the extent that we no longer have to ask or protest, but can demand, and no one questions or dares to challenge our authority to back up those demands if they are not met? So, it harkens back to what Dr. Johnson mentioned about community autonomy. What can we make happen to whoever if they continue to, and I would say the reality should be, if they even want to dare again to exploit, oppress, brutalize, and kill us? The central thing here is African Americans need to gain autonomy, and African people the world over need to gain autonomy. And I think for African Americans, three things stand out to me as most important, and they're kind of hierarchical. We need cultural autonomy. And one example is the reason why we kind of lack it is, you see the commodification of our cultural art and aesthetics in many ways, supposedly making it universal, such as that of hip hop. But people talk about hip hop being universal, and when they do, I ask them, would you say the same thing to Jewish people about Yiddish music? Would you say the same thing to Japanese people about karaoke? You could say there's universal application, but you do not remove them from it being an extension of their own brilliance. And if speaking about Japanese people, by the way, I recall maybe about a year ago, Kim Kardashian wanted to trademark the term kimono. And the Japanese community was up in arms about this because they understood the power of their own cultural property and wished no one else to benefit from it economically, socially, or otherwise. And I believe that is intelligence. And so, the power to define, determine, and drive our culture in the way that the culture that we created was intended to be used in service for us, that is what we need. We also need economic autonomy. And, I think one reason, and it really plays into the cultural autonomy, but the one reason that, or one thing that we can look at is that we don't even have the power really to fund our own politicians. When we're talking about being involved in this government, even and argue more towards how can we reconstruct this state or society. But even in the sense of trying to be involved and to make a change in this society, we can't even fund them really. And the so-called political leaders are largely beholden to those who finance their campaigns and other political agendas. And so that leads me to political autonomy. We should think of such autonomy as really not just, we should think of it beyond the parameters of local, state, and federal government. What is an international politic? And some people have spoken on this before. All other groups in this country have an international politic, based first on their own cultural centers, which often involves an acknowledgement of a common geographic, political, and sociological origin. That doesn't mean that we don't have an international policy. We don't operationalize it in the ways that we should. But there have been people that, whose shoulders on which we stand that have come before us and have laid the groundwork to ensure that we have these types of things. I challenge Black people to move beyond what Dr. Malala Karenga refers to as popular culture and assist in reassembling and advancing our nationalistic culture. We were Black people, African people, prior to the invention of America, and we will be the same after America is long gone. Whether you're conservative or liberal in your thinking, I challenge you to think, where will we be as a people without America? Can we have that type of forward thinking and understanding of, if we have no autonomy, all these things that, we're trying to fight for, once this nation is gone, we're lost too. So we should continue to fight for autonomy and freedom and victory at all costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahar. Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you. Please, the ones who are still here, please give yourselves a hand. We started off with around 1,200 people. We ended up around 500 people who stayed to the end. 5 o'clock, the program was going to go to 4, but when we saw that we had more people, we had to extend it to 5. I want to personally thank all of you who participated in this program. This has been a wonderful program. I have many things to say, many ideas to meditate on, and I want to just give you 100% of my thanks and gratitude. There are many, many questions from South Africa, from different places around the world. Is Dr. Reed Merritt still here? I don't think she's still here. There are some questions that came to specific people. We had over 165 questions, but we cannot really get to them. I just want to say one thing before I close out, and thank you very much. As we're getting ready to close out, I want to say that I give real thanks to many people who have participated, including the College of Liberal Arts, the Marketing Communications, and the Development of Alumni Relations in the CLA. Michelle Bonilla, of course, who has been really right there with us. Rosemary Fami, who worked with us on the graphics. And Peter Hanley, who has stayed with us throughout the entire project. And Peter has just been like this authorial voice in terms of the techniques, and thank him very much. And Cyril Ireland, who is also very key in CLA and is one of the persons who have helped us so much. Kim Williams as well, Belinda Wilson, Michael Wilson, and Taharka Ade, whose name does not appear there, but we're very happy that he was able to put up this final page for us. Thank all of you for coming, and we will see you at our next webinar. And those of you, we also want to mention that 200 people, if you're still there, 200 people watching it on Facebook. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.